Beginning at the start of the 5th century, a network of alliances known as the Peloponnesian League linked most of the Peloponnese to Sparta. Living in Arcadia, in the center of the Peloponnese, the banished Cleomenes failed to coordinate an anti-Spartan coalition in the 490s. Often cited were cities Mantinea and Tegea, both rivals as well as collaborators. The pair's smallest was Mantinea. In 480, the Arcadians helped the Greeks fight the Persians. Though Mantinea's army arrived later, Tegea, Sparta's oldest ally, challenged Athens's claim that it ranked second in 449. Although Elis was not present at Thermopylae in 480, he did help the army gathered at Corinth's isthmus following the war. Nevertheless, Elis's contingent arrived in Plataea after Mantinea's. Elis ruled the northern Peloponnese as far south as Olympia, about at the beginning of the 5th century. Fighting at Plataea when it was still a separate state, Tryphilia, south of Olympia and north of Messenia, 480 to 479 notes, Megara, Corinth, Sicyon, Phlius, Troezen, Epidaurus, and Hermione outside Argos. While Argos, which had never embraced Spartan sovereignty, stayed outside the fighting, citizens of Mycenae and Tiryns battled for the Greeks. Argos left the fight because of its ongoing hostility for Sparta, which was unaffected by the political change of the 490s. Mantinea and Elis might have been driven mostly by their fear of failure after punishing their generals. A jigsaw puzzle of evidence has to be assembled 20 years following the war, but we have to maximize what we already have. Two recurring themes among Elis, Mantinea, and Argos are political conflict and several failed wars directed against Sparta. Diodorus and Strabo claimed that Elis's Sinoicism started following the Persian Wars. By acquiring many towns to the east and near Olympia, Elis enhanced its authority over contemporary Tryphilia towards the middle of the 5th century. Other surrounding communities survived the establishment of the state and municipality of Elis. More evidence of a notable change in public balance of power is needed, even if Elis has a higher concentration of governmental power and has made some headway toward a change. Mantinea, a polis in the middle of the 6th century, the Argives Sinoicized during the Persian Wars. Sparta split the community into two villages, but in 370 it was rebuilt since it was unable to sustain. Though it has been proposed since 470 and has not yet been confirmed, physical Sinoicism, which has been theorized, involves the building of an urban core and migrating particular people while maintaining some of the ancient towns. When Sinoicism was outlawed and Mantinea was declared democratic in 385, the aristocracy cheered. Though it sheltered Spartan refugees before and after the Persian Wars, Tegea was a political entity in the early 6th century that fought Sparta before becoming Sparta's first ally. Its Sinoicism is unknown. Argos still had to be persuaded to join Sparta following Cleomenes' death at Sipea in 494. The fallen servants oversaw everything before the sons of the dead could run their companies. Given their different backgrounds, it is unrealistic that the Greek chattel slaves following Sipea could control the nation. Some Argonians thought there were serfs or gymnites. Conversely, Aristotle says that the Argives were compelled to engage in their perioikoi because of aristocratic abuse, as opposed to actual truth, and labels enslaved people as aristocratic abuse. Under cynicism, people from small groups will possess political or physical power. Once Argos chose not to attack Persia, Mycenae and Tiryns stayed sovereign under Spartan rule. Aristocrats who opposed the new government most certainly visited and set policies different from those of Argos. Spartan triumphs should be reported in chronological sequence. In Plataea in 479, the Arcadians, except from Mantinea at Tegea, the Messenians at the Isthmus, and the Arcadians in Tanagra, On the Persian War Monument at Olympia, Diodorus recalls the Spartan earthquake of 469/8, the Messenian Wars of 468/7, and the Mycenae siege under Argos and its allies following the Persian Wars. The Messenian War and the earthquake prevented Sparta from helping Mycenae in capture and destruction. According to Strabo, at the time Cleonae and Tegea were Argos' allies. Following his explanation of the slave government in Argos, Herodotus tells how the sons of those who died at Sapea recaptured control. The enslaved people were expelled and took over Tyrans. A seer from Phigaleia in Arcadia incited them to invade Argos. Nevertheless, Argos won after a protracted battle. During his exile from Athens, Themistocles visited Argos and other Peloponnese sites before fleeing after accusations from the Spartans. Forrest's component arrangement makes sense even if accuracy is challenging. Following Sapea, Argos experienced a kind of Sinoicism, not democracy, but men's participation denied access to leadership. This time might link Diodorus's struggle with Mycenae with Herodotus's struggle at Tegea. In the late 400s and 70s, Sinoicisms erupted in Mantinea and Elis. Argos supported Mantinea, while Themistocles supported an anti-Spartan coalition developing in the Peloponnese. Once the old ruling families took back authority, following the counter-revolution, Themistocles felt uneasy in the Early in the 460s, Mantinea resisted the other Arcadians and supported Sparta in its struggle with the Messenians amid Tyrrhene slave rebellion against Argos and Herodotus's campaign at Dipaea. Dipaea lies north of Tegea. Thus, it is unclear whether the Spartans visited the city. Isocrates argues that the conflict followed the earthquake and the Messenian War, since the Spartans fought at Dipaea using a single line of infantry instead of a phalanx. The aristocracy returning from exile in Argos, hoping to flourish under the new government, lost power. A fresh articulation of the citizen body developed contemporaneously with or soon after the division of 4 tribes into 12 phratries and the distribution of specific public property. This democratic instead of aristocratic change helps to explain why a democratic Athens formed an alliance with Argos following a split with Sparta at the end of the 460s. Argos was a democracy between years 421 and 420. The Spartans were still alive when Leonidas's son Plistarchus was slain in Thermopylae in 480/79. Until his death, Leonidas's brother Cleombrotus governed Sparta. Pausanias then took over. In the second half of the 400s and 90s, Leotychidas ascended to the Eurypontids' throne. Pausanias defeated the Persians in Plataea. Leotychidas triumphed in Mycale. 478 saw a command exchange. Leotychidas ordered an army to punish the Thessalians for aiding the Persians during the same year. Pausanias was commanding a naval expedition against Cyprus and Byzantium. Alleged to have received bribes while in a position of authority, Herodotus was tried in Sparta, exiled, and his house was destroyed. Plutarch claims that in Thessaly, Leotychidas toppled a Spartan tyrant. Among his tales on his resistance to Sparta following the war and Sparta's proposal to expel states supporting Persia from the Amphictyony, a league of northern and central Greek states under control of Delphi's sanctuary, he notes Themistocles' scheme to sink Sparta's fleet at Pagasae in Thessaly. Diodorus claims that Leotychidas passed someplace in 476 or 475. He claimed that Archidamus II became the next Eurypontid king in 469 or 468, following either the Eurypontids were exiled in 476 or 475, or perished in 469 or 468. His confusion most certainly resulted from his banishment in 476/5 and death in 469/8. Thucydides claims that Pausanias also aggravated issues by stating that never verified assertions were true. Though he was unpopular in Byzantium, he was recalled, imprisoned, and found guilty of many lesser misdeeds. He was cleared of the major Persian betrayal. The Spartans hence dispatched Dorsus to take his place. He could not, however, assume leadership since the Athenian coalition had already been formed. Thucydides claims the Spartans were happy to join Athens' new alliance, but reading the papyrus text in its natural setting, we came to the conclusion they might have been more satisfied. It seemed from Diodorus's speech that the grouse would fight to retake the lead, but Hetoemeritus convinced them against fighting. Unlike Thucydides, Sparta was well known for its secrecy. Therefore, this story might have been created when the Spartans hated Athens and wondered how it became so strong. Actually, several Spartans supported Pausanias' overseas activities. Most Aegean residents fled to Athens when he and Leotychides displayed they could not be trusted away from home, when the pro-Spartan Cimon commanded the Athenian League. Thucydides claims Pausanias left Hermione covertly aboard a ship headed for Byzantium. He was trading with the Persians rather than fighting in the Greek war. He probably worked with the Persians since he rejected to cooperate with the Athenians. The Athenians drove him from Byzantium and sent him to Colone in Asia Minor finally. Through a note, the Spartans told him to get back home. He agreed to face trial, so releasing him from custody. The accusation of Sparta by the Amphictyonic Council spurred reform. The story loses believability after that. Even if they suspected a regent, the Spartans could not defend murder of a king without evidence. The monument at Delphi shows a list of all Greek states, rather than Pausanias' original. Assertion of personal responsibility for the Persian defeat. Rather than Pausanias' original assertion of personal accountability for the Persian loss, the Delphi monument shows a list of every Greek state. Thucydides claimed that he asked the Helots for citizenship in return for their support. He kept contacts with the Persian satrap Artabazus in the Hellespont area. One of his messengers reading the letter he had been given found an order to kill him, after realizing other messengers had not returned. The ephors called a meeting to punish Pausanias for his lack of faith, hiding some witnesses when the messenger delivered this information to them. Still, the ephors lacked speed of operation. He ran to Athena's hideout in the bronze house just as the cops were about to grab him. He was taken to stop contaminating a limited area, even though he starved to death in there. Given the event has been stretched over retelling, Thucydides' assurance regarding unprovable assertions has more credibility. Pausanias died peacefully. Thus, he could have been used as a scapegoat. Yet, it is also possible that the Helots' later rebellion helped to justify the accusation against him. Presumably, he kept in touch with Artabazus in Byzantium and Colony. Although his father was King Cleomenes' half-brother, Pausanias named one of his sons Cleomenes after the quite independent King Cleomenes. Pausanias' harsh official account in Sparta after his death might have motivated Thucydides' confidence. Conversely, Thucydides thought Pausanias and Themistocles were among the most famous people of their day. The Thasians apparently asked Sparta to take Attica during Athens' war with Thasos in 465 to 463 BCE. An earthquake and a mutiny among some of the Perioikoi, especially in Messenia, made it impossible for them to enter Athens as agreed upon and keep it secret. Once more, Sparta's indifference brings this story to end. While Sparta planned to call for Cimon's help, he was still leading the Athenians in battle. Although Thasos might have asked Spartan help in the past, Athens and Sparta were not at war. Like the story of Hetoemeritus, this might have been invented subsequently. Mount Ithome, a Messenian fortification, was taken from the rebels by the Spartans. Aristophanes claims Cimon led 4,000 hoplites into combat. Conversely, the Spartans hated the Athenians' bold and revolutionary attitude. which they felt would turn against them, maybe because of Cimon's competitor Ephialtes' success at Athens. Ephialtes' resistance to Sparta's support caused the Athenians to break off their alliance with Sparta, create alliances with Sparta's enemies, and unite their strength. The rebels took over Naupactus as Athens was leaving the Peloponnese and finishing negotiations with Sparta. Thucydides said the conflict lasted 9 years. Scholars concluded from his criticism of Hellanicus that all the events in his own Pentakontaetia had to have happened chronologically, since it is impossible to find a 10-year gap between the events reported before and after this conflict. Shorten the years between them. Thucydides lets some overlap for order and clarity, since he ignores temporal expressions while moving from one sector of activity to another. Thucydides said the conflict lasted 10 years, but Diodorus was a turning point in the year 469/8. Based on his chronology source, Thucydides marks the end of the war as 456/5. Philochorus says that a specific day the earthquake happened. At that period, Thucydides writes on the end of the war. Diodorus's chronology, thus, is more likely to be accurate than Thucydides's narrative date. About the middle of the 4th century BC, the Athenians finally defeated the rebels at Naupactus. Thucydides chronicled the war as it first began. Sparta constantly worried about heliotropic control throughout the war. This struggle, which produced a truce, diverted Sparta's attention from the more fanciful features of the Greek society. Though in one area the Spartans were not particularly concerned. Early in the 450s, Nicomedes chose Plistoanax, son of Pausanias, to succeed his grandfather Archidamus. Nicomedes, Pausanias' brother, became regent of Plistoanax after Aristarchus was slain in the early 450s. Son of Pausanias, Plistoanax followed his grandfather Archidamus. Sparta predictably only strictly adhering to policies in the next years. Like the 9,000 of the archaic times, Sparta's adult population during the Persian Wars was probably around 8,000. Leuctra needs to be clear on how many less there were. 400 people at the beginning of 371 and less than 1,300 by the end. The Spartans had to persuade a lot of non-citizens to become citizens or relax the rules on fatherhood enforced by their society, even if they aimed to raise. The birth rate of citizens. The earthquake resulted in terrible population losses, but the Peloponnesian War, 10 years later, produced a more difficult recovery. In 480, Themistocles commanded the Athenian army against the Persians. Mythology holds that when Greek generals voted for a man of the campaign, they all chose Themistocles second and self first. Unknown was what happened to Themistocles in 449. Xanthippus led the Athenians in the Greek fleet, and Aristides commanded the Athenians at Plataea. Yet, the Athenians decided that other people should have an opportunity to win because of their competitiveness and situational reorganizing. Rich people produced Aeschylus's plays in 473/2. Xanthippus most certainly died in the 490, while Pericles was Chorigus. Other son of Xanthippus, Ostraca, names Ariphron as a guardian in 430. Many sources claim that Themistocles was hated by Sparta following the war. Sparta ordered that no fortified towns be established north of Corinth's isthmus. When word got to Sparta, a Spartan delegation was dispatched to Athens, but the Athenians turned them away. Other historians, including Thucydides, claim that the Athens defenses were rebuilt. Although archaeological data indicates that Athens' walls were quickly rebuilt, it is difficult to prove the accuracy of Thucydides' remark and the degree to which it enhances on reality. Less intriguing than Sparta's reformation and position strengthening in the Delphic Amphictyony are Themistocles' scheme to wipe out Sparta's navy. Previously in charge of building and defending Piraeus' port, Themistocles was Between them looms frighteningly the notion that Themistocles has a secret plan shared only with Aristides. Many books chronicle Themistocles' ambition to destroy the Spartan fleet and his resistance to a Spartan plan to forbid countries that backed the Persians from the Delphic Amphictyony. Themistocles contrasts with Cimon, the son of the Miltiades dynasty, who led the Athenians to triumph in the Battle of Marathon in 490 and considered Sparta as an enemy rather than a friend. The Spartans were overjoyed that he would lead a Delian league in the 470s and 460s. He called a son Lacedaemonius in the 470s and helped the Spartans to defeat the Messenians by defying Ephialtes. In different contexts, one could consider Themistocles and Cimon as rivals or competitors. Thucydides wonders whether the murder of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogiton, or the exile of Hippias by the Spartans, ended the power of the Pisistratid family at Athens. Simonides, a figure connected with Themistocles, may have written the inscription on the bases of the Harmodius and Aristogiton sculptures, which were erected in 477 or 478 to replace earlier sculptures brought to Susa by the Persians. Aeschylus's Persians support Themistocles in the argument over whether Athens's triumphs against the Persians were more remarkable: the victory at Salamis gained by the fleet and Themistocles, or the victory at Marathon won by the hoplites and Cimon's father, Miltiades. Cimon is associated with the Lycomede, Themistocles, a temple to Artemis Aristobule of the Greatest Council, and the painted Stoa, which features a painting depicting the Battle of Marathon from the walls of the Lycomedae. Cimon was assigned to interpret the prophecy and return with the supposed remains of Theseus. A Delphic oracle convinced Themistocles to leave Athens and fight at Salamis. There is strong evidence indicating that Themistocles and Cimon were rivals. Cimon was the more successful. Still, we should only create a small assortment of these pieces. For the first wars of the Delian League, Cimon, for example, commanded the naval infantry. Only once the city's defenses have been rebuilt does Themistocles' exile take place. He directed the drama Phrynichus in 477 to 476. It is said he attended the Olympics in 476. He campaigned for the destruction of Hieron of Syracuse, and he competed in grandeur against Cimon. Placing Aristides is less difficult than it sounds. Often considered as rivals, Themistocles symbolizes democracy, integrity, and cunning, while Aristides stands for aristocracy. One story holds that both were on the same side. Though appearing to have lived until the mid-460s, Aristides vanishes from reports of Themistocles' anti-Spartan preparations, and after founding the Delian League and its first tribute assessment. Although Xanthippus and Aristides fought Cimon on the same side throughout the Persian Wars and were not shunned in the late 480s, Themistocles was. Personalities were a concern in the 470s. Opinions of Sparta were nuanced, and recent events could be seen from many angles. It should be articulated precisely. From the other side, Athens' government demanded conversation. Traditionally, Aristides argued for the constitution to be common, opposed an oligarchic plot during the Battle of Plataea, and wanted every Athenian to vote for leaders following the war. If the plotters are pro-Persian rather than oligarchic, these first assertions could be true. The second, however, is difficult to understand beyond that someone thought it acceptable to attribute democratic leanings to Cimon, who was on the anti-democratic side of the constitutional debate, while those connected with Themistocles were pro-democratic. From the other side, Themistocles had left Athens. Preference and discrimination drove Themistocles into banishment. The invasion of Xerxes brought back memories of those banished in the 480s. Aristides and Xanthippus rose to general, while Hipparchus had not returned and was branded a traitor. Once more, Ostracism took place in the 400s and 70s, the second episode of Megacal expulsion from Alcmaeonid. Though he was now hated, Themistocles survived the year 480. Some people cast votes against the dead. As Thucydides describes rebuilding Athens's walls, our account has already been embellished. Following Pausanias' loss, the Spartans accused Themistocles of using mesmerism with him and sent him to Athens for examination. Rejected, he went to Argos. Corcyra left for King Admetus of the Molossi on the far side of the continent before his summons could get to Argos, after he started to get afraid to meet him. After arriving in Asia, he wrote to the Persian king, studied the language, and gained respect once he visited the court and picked it up. Having owned 3 towns in Asia Minor, Magnesia for his bread, Myus for his sauce, and Lampsacus for his wine, he apparently lived at Magnesia. This aligns with Persian custom, whereby subordinates receive gifts instead of money. The fall of Themistocles is connected to several chronological issues in the search for solutions to the 470s and 460s, including the appearance of the oldest known coin picture on Magnesia's coins. Diodorus presents a remarkable narrative for every year of 471-0, but the distributions are only rather consistent. Should 473/2 be written as a defense of Themistocles, it could have been before or following Aeschylus's excommunication and conviction. When he met Thucydides, he came upon Artaxerxes, who had lately replaced his father. We think Themistocles arrived in Asia sometime in 465 BC. August 465 saw Xerxes seize rule of the area. Plutarch says some 4th century historians had him seize Xerxes, the king he had fought at Salamis. But if this were true, it would have been so beautiful that the less interesting narrative would not have been needed. Scholars have turned Themistocles' crossing of the Aegean into inspiration. Thucydides said he joined a merchant ship at Pydna, Macedonia, intending to go incognito, but he identified himself to the captain and asked for safety when they arrived at Naxos during the Athenian siege. He finally landed in Ephesus. Pretending to be a disciple of Thucydides, Plutarch leads Themistocles past Thasos to Syme. Knowing which siege Themistocles had to flee would enable us to date his passage of the Aegean, but the two conflicting narratives of his escape from Athenian capture contradict one another. Though the Thasos version of the story is historically more plausible, it does not make it accurate. Themistocles may have fled to Asia before being banished. If Themistocles had left Athens about the year 470, it would have matched the history of the Peloponnese, which we can reconstruct. 490, the Persians invaded Greece, and Themistocles removed the Spartan kings. Hippias and Demaratus escorted them. The exiled Athenian king Themistocles could not accompany them. Among many eminent Greeks banished under Persian rule was Themistocles. Among the most well-known Greeks Thucydides listed was Pausanias. His guilt connected to mesmerism became obvious after the Athenians denounced him. Although our sources should add more specifics, this was a turning point in Athens's history. Thucydides presents Cimon as having helped Sparta and Athens change their foreign rather than domestic policies. Though this is not Diodorus's main event for the year, assuming it is based on his chronological source, that source has to be changed since the definitely earlier date of 462/1 calls for revision. The Areopagus dominated the political system for almost 17 years, following the Persian Wars until it progressively fell apart. As the population expanded, the son of Sophonides Ephialtes developed as a populist defender. As a politician, he appeared to be moral and reliable. He attacked the Areopagus Council from below. First, he charged several of its members for crimes committed while in office. Conon removed all accretions that bestowed upon the council guardianship of the constitution, distributing some to the Council of 500 and others to the people and juries while he was archon. declared lords of the law courts, they took over the Areopagus Council and removed all but a few of its delegates, transforming the city into a true democracy. They finally became free when the people started another campaign, challenging the constitutional order and customarily observed observances. Pericles had well-known and persuasive points of view. Reformers would have regarded the powers taken from the Areopagus as accretions, while their opponent might have considered them a necessary component of the current system. Ephialtes might have attacked former archons to discredit the council they would have joined. 9 archons joined this group as permanent members. The word most likely relates to the general situation of the Areopagus in Athens, as opposed to a specific power. The Areopagus developed new legal processes to safeguard the constitution without express permission. But just what are their actual powers? When it came time to sentence offenders, they turned the Areopagus over to constitutional judicial review. From the Areopagus, Ephialtes will most certainly acquire 2 talents: establishing a system known as evangelia, usually translated as impeachment. The Areopagus at Athens punished Solon on the grounds of grave transgressions against the state. Athenians underwent several behavior audits, including a domatia validation process, before being let to enter the workforce. Later, the legislature, the Council of 500, and jury courts addressed the matter. At the time, the Areopagus had sold off its power. The term of each official ends with a vote of confidence. Though we still don't know, validation and accounting systems might have existed in Athens before Ephialtes' reforms. Though unproven, it is also reasonable that they were at the Areopagus when Ephialtes abducted them. In Isangelia, Areopagus possessed great political power. He eventually lost it. The court's jurisdiction covered several religious transgressions, murders, and injuries. Examining several theories is necessary here. Late in the 5th century, a paranormal prosecution for illegality might reverse the decision of an assembly as illegal or unpleasant. Though no documentation of such a privilege exists, some believe this was a democratic substitute for the Areopagus's veto authority over assembly decisions. The archons, not the Areopagus, experienced a power loss at this period. Many litigation was decided upon in the 1st century of the 5th century. Appeals were automatic towards the end of the century, and the archon oversaw jury trials. Although laws were passed to standardize the new procedures, it is better to expect constant evolution, since those against whom archons rendered decisions started to use their right of appeal more frequently. If they existed at the time of the Attic orators, we should have heard about a board of 7 law guardians noted for the last time in the late 4th century. Philochorus must have thus either misrepresented what happened or committed a mistake. In 453/2, itinerant judges oversaw the more subdued private litigation. Athens's more vigilant supervision of the Delian League and Ephialtes' reforms would make the Council of 500 and the jury courts busier. Each tribe has sent 50 delegates since Cleisthenes founded the council. But it was not until Ephialtes that these delegates constituted the Prytaneus, the council's permanent committee. Prytaneus must have been thoroughly recorded before Ephialtes, since their Tholos on the west side of the Agora dates back to about 460. If the Areopagus had been rebuilt in 460, then there would have been an Areopagite rebirth following Cleisthenes, based on their rule of Athens during the Persian Wars. Depowering the Areopagus towards the end of the 460s served what goal? One cannot easily believe that a renaissance has taken place. Since 487 divided by 6, when the lot chose the archons who would join the Areopagus, elected generals gained power, and Cleisthenes' political framework demanded and must have inspired significant populist action. Specifically as a provocation, Areopagus most certainly cleared Cimon on euthanasia and found Themistocles guilty on an Isangelia. Those ready to take over Athens's affairs may have wondered who had the power, since exarchons were no longer revered in Athens, but served for life and frequently sided with Cimon. The third class, Solon's Zeugitai, stood to earn as much as his fourth class, depending on personality, foreign policy, and self-interest. Although the League of Athens' emergence and the impact of the less wealthy people rowing the ships did have an impact, this should not be interpreted as a victory for the rowers against the hoplites. Conversely, a significant constitutional revision grounded on democratic values could represent a turning point in Athens' history. A self-aware democracy would eventually support and occasionally impose democratic constitutions on members of the Delian League. Athens began writing on an unheard-of scale decree of the assembly, accounting of expenses and other public papers on stone shortly after this reform. The architects of the new democracy seem to have considered that the demos needed to be kept informed to operate properly. A modern source claims that Ephialtes was a bad expedition commander traveling to Asia Minor's southern coast. Still, we have no more knowledge about him. Plutarch claims that Pericles supported him and helped to reform the Areopagus, but says nothing else. This might be more accurate. In 404/3, the 30 government changed the laws of Ephialtes and an unidentified Archestratus. Not too long later, Ephialtes was killed by Aristodicus of Tanagra. In Herodotus 68, the Athenians were never named as supporters of Aristodicus. For a long time, people have debated how much the political environment at a play's debut influences it. Most of the contemporary Athenian tragedies center on heroic ideas. The civic elements of Dionysus's celebrations and themes in plays pertinent to 5th century polis citizens now take the front stage. Some old tragicomedies drew on modern events. Angering the Athenians who had supported the Ionians in the year before, Themistocles would have performed the capture of Miletus by Persia by Phrynichus when he was Archon in 493/2. Phrynichus wrote a tragedy about the Persian defeat in 477-476 BCE, in which the Phoenician women were defeated. He served as Themistocles' choreographer. Still, Aeschylus's Persians made it. Pericles choreographed the 473/2 performance focusing on Xerxes' ex-wives and the Persian loss at Salamis. It is a Greek and Athenian patriotic drama since the success depends on the Athenian fleet. From another perspective, the focus of the play on Salamis and Themistocles sets Cimon against Themistocles in favor of the latter. Ephialtes' changes indeed took place before Aeschylus penned Suffering Women, though this drama stresses that the citizen assembly, not the king, connected the two sides of democracy by deciding whether to accept the suppliants' ballots. It is set in the glorious past of Argos and features a cruel king. Aeschylus supported democracy when it was first suggested, even though it is unnecessary to believe that he engaged in simple political propaganda. Apparently, against Aeschylus, Sophocles competed in 469 BCE and persuaded Cimon and his other generals to serve as substitute judges, awarding Sophocles first place. Aeschylus corresponds to those who support democracy. Therefore, even if communication had improved, Sophocles might have written more important plays. Written soon after Ephialtes' reforms in 459/8, the Oresteia by Aeschylus Orestes is tried by the Areopagus for the murder of his mother, Clytemnestra, in the last play, Eumenides. It is closely linked to Aeschylus' portrayal of the Areopagus, which kept carrying out its responsibilities quickly after the reform. Yet some see it as his support, while others see it as his grief. Athens and Argos were allies during the performance. The drama hence accentuates their affinity. It is yet unknown, though, when or why he left Athens. Midway into the 5th century, at the height of the Athenian Empire, the Egyptian campaign and the First Peloponnesian War took place. After Timon's banishment, Athens broke relations with Sparta and turned to allies at Argos in the Peloponnese and Thessaly in northern Greece. Agreeing to stretch the fighting into Egypt,
they grew more hostile on the Greek mainland during the First Peloponnesian War. By divorcing from Sparta and combining with Megara on the Isthmus of Corinth, Athens set a precedent linking the Peloponnese to central Greece. Athens and Corinth needed several years to guard the area between Megara and Nicaea, Athens's port city on the Saronic Gulf. Page, Megara's second harbor, provided access to the Corinthian Gulf. Following its conquest of Epidaurus on land at Haliaeus, Athens battled Argos in the Saronic Gulf and emerged victorious in a naval action near Secrephalia. With Xerxes' invasion, the protracted struggle between Athens and Aegina ended. Now the Athenians were acting first and winning a naval battle. Many Corinthian hoplites who had progressed to the mega race supported Aegina. Athens sent a reserve army to the Megarid rather than leaving Aegina. A few days later, the Corinthians declared a victory after winning a hard-fought battle. According to Thucydides, a long wall building had begun at this moment. Consequently, Athens, Piraeus, and Phalerum-Athens's long walls should have been built before the Megara long walls. Before starting the Peloponnesian War, Athens forced Aegina to sign a contract to join the Delian League. Only Thasos comes close with a 4% annual growth rate. We need more information about Corinth in the 400s and 60s after helping Athens seize Aegina in the 400s and 90s. Megara's arrival to Athens, since she provided defense against Peloponnesian attacks, most likely explains this. These conflicts most likely feature Sparta, which was not mentioned since Messenian rebels kept them occupied. Pausanias agreed to travel to Egypt following a battle in Cyprus in 478, where the Libyan king started a revolt against Persia and killed the satrap Achaemenes. Egypt was a part of the Greek world. The Greeks had been dealing with and employing mercenaries in Egypt for 200 years. Thus, it was reasonable to
expect Egypt to be involved in a Greek war against Persia. Athens had not turned over to the Persians. They besieged Memphis from most of the Nile Delta and captured most of it. If we had an Athenian casualty count, we would have known that this campaign included Cyprus, Egypt, Phoenicia, Haliaeus, Aegina, and Megara. Perhaps in response to Athenian activities, Ezra was sent to Jerusalem by the Persians in 458. Nehemiah was dispatched to Jerusalem in 445, while Egypt was still under contact with Athens. It is more likely that Nehemiah was sent there in 455. Though far from clear, it is likely that Doris, the site thought to have been praised for the tribute, was close to Mount Carmel in Palestine. Greek town Zelea on the Propontis. The earliest evidence we have for a possible 5th century passage from the 4th century prohibiting Arthemius of Zelea from bringing Persian money from Athens and the League to the Peloponnese comes from, if such is the case, it could have happened when Cimon returned to Athens some years later. Unable to buy off the Spartans, the Persians tried to meddle in Greek politics by invading Attica via a Persian envoy named Megabazus. At last, the Persians dispatched Megabyxus and a sizable army to Egypt. He drove the Greeks out of Memphis, besieged them in Prosopotis for 18 months, and finally drove them by canal emptying. Most Greeks perished. A rescue squad showed up just in time. Amyrtaeus, the king of the marshes, temporarily resisting, was betrayed and crucified. Based on Thucydides' account, the Greeks suffered a great catastrophe following 6 years of war. Some used Ctesias to disprove Thucydides' assertions that the Greek army was far smaller before or after the war. Though Persia did not inspire the Spartans to attack Athens, a Peloponnesian army drove the Phocians from their homeland, Doris. Returning from the Corinthian Gulf, the Athenians closed land and sea access across the isthmus. An army dispatched from Athens greeted the Peloponnesians when they arrived in Boeotia. While the Peloponnesians survived sufficiently to return across the isthmus, both sides suffered heavy losses during a Tanagra battle. Following their victory over the Boeotians at Oenophyta, the Athenians reclaimed central Greece's rule 2 months later. Thucydides claims that in Tanagra, some hostile Athenians interacted with the Peloponnesians. Plutarch claims that Cimon urged his friends to fight valiantly and loyally after the Attic army turned away them. They died in the fighting. Plutarch and other writers assert that the war did not end, and Cimon was not returned to Athens before his 10-year exile. After round-tripping the Peloponnese, the Athenians' Tolmides-led naval force routed the Spartans in the Corinthian Gulf. After they conquered it, Naupactus most likely became their residence. Once the Messenians left the Peloponnese, Athens' growth stopped. An expedition by Pericles failed to retrieve the banished king Orestes in Thessaly. In the Corinthian Gulf, an expedition headed by Pericles defeated Sicyon at Corinth, but failed to seize Oeniadae close to the Gulf entrance. Thucydides brokered a 5-year ceasefire between Athens and the Peloponnesians 3 years later. In 446 to 447, the Spartans attacked Attica. In 451, Sparta and Argos also reached another 30-year agreement. 454, right after the truce ended, could be the setting for the Thessalian War and Pericles' voyage. The Athenian death count indicates that the First Peloponnesian War started about 460 or 459, since Thucydides notes a 6-year Egyptian expedition ending in 455 or 454. Diodorus claims that Tolmides' expedition occurred in 456/5 at Tanagra in 458/7. Under rules 458/7 and 457/6, Tanagra and Oenophyta have fought 2 months apart. Some academics speculated that the Athenians' curiosity in the west resulted from a connection with Egesta, an inland city west of Sicily that still uses the old type of Athenian letters, and a wish to mix struggle with Persia with Greek development. Although the 415 Athenian missions to Sicily were ostensibly sent there to assist Egesta, this inscription most likely developed before that expedition. The paper's prologue revealed the archon's name, but only the last 2 letters were clearly pronounced. On, which regrettably finishes most archons' names. Antiphon's reading countered claims that other letters had turned up and Hebron or Antiphon had been found. Had Cimon not been summoned back so early in 451, he would have changed policy. The Athenians refrained from intervening in the Greek struggle after a 5-year ceasefire, and Cimon returned to Cyprus with a league force. Many ships traveled on to Egypt, where Amyrtaeus was still battling. Cimon perished, and the siege of Citium was lifted when the Persians finally drove the League army on land and water. Thucydides writes of other Greek events at Athens, Persia, and the League. Delphi's rule was contested in a holy struggle. 30 years of peace followed a revolt by Athens' possessions on the mainland effort during the 30 Years' War. A few lines from the following sources offer details on the changes in the Delian League around the middle of the century. Delos housed the original treasury of the Delian League. Still, in 454/3, Athens created the Athenian tribute lists, a set of lists of gifts given to Athena's treasury, depending more on individual donations than on annual totals. Though evidence is lacking, Delian Apollo had a gift indeed. One book links the event to the Samians. Pericles is credited with it. Although the action is usually presented as evidence of Athenian imperialism, there could have been legitimate worries about a Persian comeback following the Egyptian catastrophe. Comparing related records to the degree to which the lists are still accessible allows historians to determine which states paid tribute, in which years, and how much they paid. In preambles on the year 420, the Athenians began calling upon the Archon of the year. Though there are some earlier instances when the Archon of the year is mentioned, the pertinent section of the text is sometimes lost or damaged. Many opinions of the Athenian assembly point to middle-of-century developments, such as in the 5th century, over 700 internal officials served Athens. Efficiency was challenging due to this fragmentation and the fact that almost every official was replaced yearly, but there were other objectives as well. Few servant clerks kept records. Their occupations were accessible and offered little opportunity for good or bad. It was believed that people would be competent and willing to contribute and that employment opportunities would be dispersed equitably among them. Even though many of the officials were new to their current roles, the risk of inefficiency was lessened because they had previously held other posts. The council that prepared the meeting was well versed in the public life of Athens, and many of the attendees had recently held public offices. Consequently, the administrative structure affected the assembly's ability to make decisions. The demes selected their council delegates by lot for 1 year, according to their size, and men might serve twice throughout their lifetimes. The council monitored the whole administrative process. In the early years of Athens, the Areopagus Council and 9 archons administered justice. Nearly all prosecutions were started by a single person. Solon maintained to differentiate between dikai, the broad word under which only the injured individual or their family could submit a claim, and graphic public prosecutions on charges against which anyone might file a claim in the early 6th century. Archons' rulings are also subject to appeal. By the second half of the 5th century, the appeals system allowed the archon to do the preparatory study before issuing a verdict in the court he presided over. In 453/2, the Areopagus's judicial authority was consolidated when the minor dike was placed under the jurisdiction of a nomadic deme judge. Most cases were tried in dicasteries by archons or other dike authorities. Nevertheless, specific processes were in place for exceptional circumstances. With the assistance of legal representation, litigants presented their own cases to juries. The archon presided but needed knowledge, and there were many jurors. The trial may last just 1 day. In the current climate, when state administrative apparatuses are crucial, keeping the courts apart from the government is necessary. Due to the necessity of updating the administrative infrastructure in Athens and the rest of the Greek world, it was determined that judicial authority should be added to administrative offices' executive authority. Consequently, multiple authorities ruled over allegations of administrative malfeasance. In addition to gaining judicial authority over administrative problems, the council was required to send cases to dicasteries if a punishment of more than 500 drachmas was warranted. As a result, the courts became unprofessional entities that served the general people. The misconception is that a trial is a fight in which the judges make decisions based on opposing arguments rather than formal claims, and supporting evidence must be rectified. The Athenians' inability to discriminate between criminal behavior and politically naive and inept public officials was more troubling than their behavior. Too fast, it was thought that a competing politician or a failing commander had intentionally failed to act in Athens' best interests, and because no Athenians would do so voluntarily, they were paid to do so. Most of the time, active politicians and military leaders were accused of deceiving the public, equating criminality with political error. By the middle of the 5th century, the 9th archons had established themselves as regular rulers and taken the city's primary administrator role. When the state was militarily potent, the 10 generals served as Athens's army and navy commanders and were its most prominent leaders. The people selected political leaders, in contrast to public employees of the period who were chosen by allocation. They were also eligible for indefinite re-election. Cleisthenes appointed 10 generals from each tribe as permanent officers, but by the end of the 4th century the tribal system had been abandoned. While 1 general per tribe remained the standard from 441 to 0 until the middle of the 4th century, there was at least one exception. Before this discovery, It was believed that this was done to give Pericles a prominent position while giving other tribe members an opportunity. However, the aim seemed to provide for situations where one tribe lacked a formidable opponent and no general stood out. When we are aware of two generals from the same tribe, neither of them seems to have been an also-ran who may have been selected in the second round of voting. It is typical for a guy from another tribe to offer himself to or be approached by a tribe that lacks a strong candidate. A system that thought a respectable citizen should lead and be controlled, as opposed to one designed to create a gulf between the authorities and the general populace. Yet it made exceptions for reflective elected generals. The conference gathered a variety of people, from regulars to infrequent visitors. At any one period, just a handful of active lawmakers filed decrees routinely. Others who loved participating in politics had a variety of jobs. However, many people must periodically accept the office for the system to function. In Aristophanes' Wasps, it is implied that jury duty attracts experienced older men who appreciate the stipend. Nonetheless, while sitting on the council, several members may offer recommendations. People who lived close to or had access to hospitality were likelier to engage in public life than those who lived farther away. But they might also do business while attending the assembly. It would have been easier to participate in the assembly when required, and it would have discouraged frequent political engagement. Because its members were chosen by the dames, the council should have had a city clique. By the end of the 5th century, the democratic system had become egalitarian. Like stipends, wealthier persons may devote more time to volunteering for the public good. In contrast to assembly attendance, this would have significantly impacted time-intensive posts, since members of the lowest property class were still required to be eligible for office. As a result of Athens' empire, councils and assemblies had to make more decisions, administrative tasks, and posts had to be filled, and more conflicts were filed before the courts than in a typical city. The people, or the majority of them, had significant authority. After Cleisthenes advised ostracism in 480, it was used for 30 years. The assembly votes annually on whether to execute ostracism. If it does, there is no list of candidates. Each voter writes or has the name of his preferred victim inscribed on a potsherd. If a total of at least 6,000 votes are cast, the person with the most votes must be banished for 10 years without losing his property. The Ostraka survivors demonstrate that many men remained to be chosen. Some individuals earned a few votes out of spite, but those who obtained a substantial number opposed well-known figures. Cimon was ostracized in the 400s and 70s, but not Themistocles. Cimon was shunned towards the end of the 400s and 60s, but not Ephialtes. The winner was deported from Athens while the loser was chosen among competing political figures. In 415, when Hyperbolus was rejected, but Nicias and Alcibiades were not, ostracism was utilized again. This is due to the unpredictability of ostracism's effects. Based on the inscriptions on pertinent boards of overseers, a substantial Acropolis construction project may be dated. The Parthenon, the temple of Athena Parthenos, was constructed between 447/6 and 433/2. Callicrates and Ictinus constructed the Parthenon, a Doric architectural marvel. A frieze at the top of the cellar wall depicts a procession whose meaning has been questioned for a considerable time. To create the impression of regularity, they vary from inherent regularity in areas such as column arrangement. Many of its sculptures were bought by Lord Elgin in 1801 from the Ottoman Empire, which had abandoned its Greek antiquities, and were subsequently acquired by the British Museum in 1801-1816. When addressing whether they should be restored, they argued that things taken from their original position were acceptable by historical norms but illegitimate by current ones. Phaedius, a friend of Pericles, and the man in charge of the whole undertaking, constructed the gold and ivory statue of Athena in the eastern chamber of the temple between 447/6 and 438/7. Parallel to the Parthenon, construction on the restored Propylaea started under Themistocles, but was abandoned as the Peloponnesian War loomed. Despite disagreements over the dates of the first decree and the various stages of temple construction, it is possible that the temple was planned in the 440s to commemorate the victory over the Persians from the Battle of Marathon onwards, even if it wasn't built, and the priestess didn't assume her position until later. Whether or not a formal treaty signified the conclusion of the fight with the Persians was over. Thucydides understood that, in light of the Persian defeat and Athens's fame, the ruins of Athens would seem considerably more formidable than they were. After the Persians destroyed the temple in 479, it seems improbable that a deal was made to leave it as a war memorial temple in ruins. Delos was no longer the capital of the Delian League by the middle of the century. Therefore, the idea of constructing a new temple to Apollo was abandoned. Plutarch devoted a substantial amount of his Pericles to this construction endeavor. According to Pericles' opponents, using the money from Delos to battle the Persians made Athens seem like a lustful woman. In addition to offering an immediate source of employment for its residents who could not fight, Athens pledged protection to its allies and offered to pay for it personally if the assembly refused. Even though the price was out of reach for all but the wealthiest members, the assembly supported him heartily. Propylaea accounts for more than 50% of the Acropolis expenses. The League may make a direct contribution in addition to funding the military costs that Athens would have been responsible for if it had not been for the fact that the League would now pay the war-related expenses that were previously paid by tribute. In the 440s and 430s, a papyrus fragment may have shown an excess financial transfer from League to Athenian finances. There may have been a decline in tribute, but not in League income. Before 450 BC, the Athenian state instituted the Fighting in Front public construction system, administered by democratically elected epistatae. Many of the 440 and 430 constructions in Athens and the rest of Attica were attributed to the same architect. Nevertheless, it is claimed that more than parallels are necessary to support the employment of a single architect, and that the work started earlier and was completed later. Even though the Persians were their primary competitors, the Athenians and other Greeks adopted Persian styles. Pericles is also credited with building the intermediate wall between Athens and the Piraeus, which was constructed between the two original long walls, and the Odium, which was intended to resemble the tent of the Persian monarch. He also labored at Thurii, an Athenian settlement in Italy, where Hippodamus of Miletus built the port of Piraeus. Pericles was significant in Athens from the mid-4s to the 1950s, until he died in 429. He could not have had the impact that Thucydides intended for his readers, and some scholars have been reluctant to believe that Pericles was chiefly responsible for Athens' policies at the time. The outcome of Pericles' vote in the assembly remained secret, even while he could never be sure that a particular vote would go his way. According to our sources, the assembly's votes often went his way, reinforcing the prevailing attitude. After Cimon's death, Thucydides and Melesia claim to have assumed opposition leadership. Thucydides, who was not a politician, united his upper-class followers in the assembly by ordering them to sit as democratic and oligarchic representatives. The assembly supported Pericles despite Thucydides' insistence, particularly about the construction program, and Thucydides was expelled when ostracism was carried out. According to Plutarch, Pericles was among the numerous rival politicians who strove to harmonize his different sources. It is risky to assume that Thucydides was rejected in 444/3, but it must have occurred within that time frame. It would be dangerous to claim that Thucydides was ostracized in 444/3, since he served as general for the next 15 years. Even though Pericles was not exiled, one of his allies, Damon, may have been. Other comedians, particularly Aristophanes, made fun of Pericles' enormous head. Callias, the well-known athletic son of Didymus IV, whose political beliefs are unclear, was also omitted. Plutarch is misled by Aristophanes' piece into attributing the Peloponnesian War to a series of assaults beginning in the early 4th century. Pericles was determined to have his way with everything after Thucydides' departure. After finishing his statue of Athena in 438-7, Phidias departed Athens after being accused of corruption. He was commissioned in 432/1 to make a statue of Zeus for Olympia, but he died there due to complications. Also, Plutarch's account might be more accurate, and the archon's names should be corrected in that book. Because Pericles' child was chosen in 410-9, we should anticipate an attack when the relationship was still new. Hermippus accused Aspasia of Miletus, the beloved of Pericles, of being an atheist. Was the person who issued the order barring people from believing in divine things or spreading knowledge about things in the air reacting to Aristophanes' clouds, and maybe also to Pericles' Milesian friend Anaxagoras? Anaxagoras' career is obscure, although he was tried for impiety in 437 or 438. Cleon was the prosecutor, but Thucydides was apparently allegedly involved. For further details, see Doig. Second layout. Plutarch explicitly blames Pericles. We know the charge was connected to Phidias's case and that Pericles was found not guilty due to the lack of more information. Hagnon substituted Dracontides' obsolete ceremonial trial with an anticipated dicasterian trial. If these invasions had happened in the first part of 430, Thucydides would have escaped Athens. Hermippus jokes about Pericles being assaulted by Cleon, maybe Anaxagoras' attorney. In Knights of Cleon, Aristophanes states that the leather merchant is preceded by two other sellers, already established in 430. On the other hand, Thucydides makes no mention of Pericles' adversaries, portraying him as an unopposed commander throughout the Peloponnesian War. In his analysis of Athens' supremacy following the 30 Years' Peace, Thucydides recalls the battle against Samos in 440 to 439. After Samos took possession of Priene on the Asian continent to the north of Miletus, Miletus summoned Athens with the aid of some rebel Samians. As Athens interfered in Samos, capturing hostages, installing a garrison, and instituting a democracy, the fleeing Samians received aid from Plisthenes, the satrap of Sardis, and regained power. Byzantium rose against Athens in favor of Samos. 60 ships arrived from Athens, 40 from Chios, and 25 from Lesbos and Chios under the government of Pericles. Samos, Lesbos, and Chios were the only Delian League members still contributing ships after the fight, and they besieged the city. When Pericles dispatched a portion of his army to deal with Phoenician ships deployed by the Persians to defend Samos, the Samians won a battle and seized control of the sea. After a 9-month siege, the Samians capitulated due to his return, leadership, and reinforcements. Their ships surrendered, their hostages were released, a portion of their fortifications was destroyed, and Athens was reimbursed for its war expenses. There are 1,200 citations in works of literature. In an inscription, the Athena treasury recorded to pay for the battle totaling 1,400 tal. A decree listing 3,000 of them will be issued in 434/3. During this battle, it is probable that the Athenians stole money from the temple coffers, which was reimbursed in 434/3, since Athena's treasury was now empty. Athens established a democracy at the beginning of the episode. However, The resolution offered in the text must be changed to provide a clear response while using less forceful language than the introduction. Thucydides does not include the Corcyra battle in his description of Athens in 432. The Corinthians prevailed against a plan to aid Samos in the Peloponnesian League. To reach that point, however, Sparta would have had to help Samos, which would have violated the 30 years peace stipulations. Support for Samos by Plisthenes would have violated the Callias peace. Peloponnesians and Persians may have intervened. Athens was compelled to commit large armies and came closer to defeat than ever before. Despite their reputation for grandeur, the 30 years' peace prevented the Athenians from entering mainland Greece. However, they proceeded to expand wherever possible. Thucydides omits Pentecontaetia, which would have supported his claim that Sparta's dread of Athens and its dominance precipitated the Peloponnesian War. The destruction of Sybaris by Croton in 510 was compensated for in various ways across Italy. The Sybarites asked Athens and Sparta for assistance for the last time, and Athens granted their plea. The Athens decree regarding an alliance with Egesta in Sicily dates to 418/7, not 458/7. The West was a potential source of food and expansion opportunity. After conquering the original Sybarites at this foundation, the newcomers renamed the community Thurii and dispatched other Greek immigrants to repopulate. During the new period of Thurii, 10 tribes had democratic constitutions. Laman and Xenocritus administered the foundation. Supposedly, Charonda and Protagoras established the laws. This is Diodorus's principal episode for 446/5, and he writes sparingly about Thurii for the next 2 years. Lysias, the orator, is reported to have come around 444/3 or 443/2, while Thucydides, the son of Melesias, went to Thurii after being rejected. Also noted is that Herodotus arrived around 444/3. The dates 446/5 and 444/3 have been given to Sybaris and Thurii respectively. However, there is no date mentioned. Unlike Sparta, the Peloponnese had a diverse population. As his main point for the year 434/3, Diodorus remembers a dispute within Thurii over the city's founding father. Delphi ascribed Apollo's birth to people who did not desire to be confined to Athens. In 415 to 413, the Athenians prevailed, notwithstanding Thurii's subsequent support for Sparta. In 433/2, Athens planned to renew its treaties with Leontini in Sicily and Rhegium along the southern coast of Italy. The text supports a mid-440s date for the original alliance with Rhegium, and a little earlier date for Leontini. The Athenians also contributed to the establishment of Neapolis, which was located farther north. Early in 430, an Athenian army led by Phormio engaged in the foundation of Amphilochian Argos in northwest Greece in opposition to Corinth's colony, Ambracia. The Athenians built a colony in the Aegean region at Amphipolis near the Strymon, which could be crossed inland from Ion in an area rich in silver and wood. This time, Athenians and non-Athenians lived together. During his stint as director of the organization, Hannon was revered as a hero. Athenians were heartbroken when Amphipolis was captured in 424 to 425 BC. The search for Pericles led him to Sinope, where he built a colony on the southern shore. Under 434/3 of his chronological source, Diodorus identified colonies at Astacus in the Propontis and Amisus from the same period. In 438 or 437, when Spartacus the Phraates established the Spartocid dynasty, Athens allied with Satyrus I, the dynasty's successor. Strabo believes that the first alliance between Athens and the Spartacid tyrants occurred between 430 and 563 BCE. Thucydides differentiated in Sicily between the native Sicans, whom he believed to be the island's initial occupants, the Elymans at Egesta, who were reputedly exiled from Troy, and the Cycles, who migrated from Italy to the western half of the island. The Italian immigrants came to the island's western coast. Except for the Elymans, who came in the 5th century, they lived mainly in the interior, and by the 5th century, the different indigenous peoples were still considered separate groups. With some Hellenization, they may be archaeologically recognized. Between 735 and 625 BC, Greek immigrants known as Siciliots established colonies along the coast, except the extreme west. It is possible to find Phoenician sites in the far west. The Carthaginians claimed Sicily with Rome in around 509, but if they had anticipated expansion when accepting an invitation to fight with the Greeks in 480, their loss stopped them from doing so, and they only tried again at the end of the 5th century. Italy were indigenous Italians, as opposed to Italians and Greeks who lived south of the Bay of Naples before 750. In contrast to the local Sicilians, the native Italians were not Hellenized. Several events and rulers are recorded in different areas throughout the early years of Greek colonization, but we need help connecting them. In the 5th century, the situation in Italy remained stable, but in Sicily, a series of tyrants who started governing about 505 seized control of Syracuse in 485 and forged alliances or enemies with other tyrants. Herodotus narrated the events up to 480, when Cimon of Syracuse was prohibited from aiding the Greeks of Greece in their conflict with the Persians. In Sicily, Diodorus depended on Ephorus for the remainder of his 5th and 4th century Greek history. Pindar's odes, which focus primarily on Sicilian kings, are also available with ancient commentary. The historical dates provided by Diodorus and Aristotle for the West are only as precise as those for Greece. Victor's lists and Pindar's the most important city in eastern Sicily, Gela, had developed as a Rhodian Cretan colony on the southern coast. Gelon, the first king from one of Gela's illustrious families, was flourishing and securing Syracuse as the best location. When Hieron hired laborers from outside areas to help build, Gela became his capital. Another authoritarian family lives in Akragas. Gelon marries Theron's daughter, Demerede, and Theron marries Gelon's brother, Polyzelus. The Northern Alliance sprang from Rhegium, a Euboean colony at Italy's southernmost point, and Himera. Reacting to Theron's seizure of Himera and exile of Turillus and Anaxius of Rhegium effectively petitioned Carthage for aid in 480. This produced a great conflict. After taking Himera, Gelon joined the Syracusan alliance mostly in response to the Anaxius. Hieron and Orbit's daughter married one other. Tyrants strengthened aristocratic concepts of goal-oriented life. They invited poets to their palaces to tell their adventures and build magnificent temples for the gods. Though he is identified as Gelon, son of Dinomenes, the Syracusan, poetry refers to him as a king in notable Greek sanctuaries. We should go back over a 5th century event. Under Italian rule, Croton sacked the fabled rich city of Sybaris in 510. Half-brother of Cleomenes, Dorius, left Sparta following Cleomenes' elevation to king. After Cleomenes came to rule Sparta, Dorius battled for Croton and then founded a colony in northwest Sicily, but the Egesta and Phoenicians attacked and killed him. Diodorus at Gelon asked that his burial be subject to a ban on ostentatious funeral customs, but his triumph against the Carthaginians offset the unpopularity of his previous population moves in 478/7, and he was buried honorably and revered as a hero. Son of Gelon, Hieron fled Gela and made Syracuse his home. Polyzelus, his younger brother, passed over the widowed Demerete. Polyzalos brought Delphi a bronze charioteer following his victory in a chariot race. In the first inscription, Polyzalos is called Lord of Gela, unlike Jalon and Hieron, who separately paid for the monument. According to recent accounts, Hieron considered Polyzalos as a rival right away. An opportunity arose when Sybaris, under Croton's siege, asked Hieron for help. Hieron expected hired assassins, or Croton, to kill Polyzalos. Different people have different stories of what happened exactly at the moment. When Himera's envoys reject Thrasymachus' choice of Hieron, Hieron betrays them to Theron, who then sets up Hieron and Polyzalos to be reunited. Diodorus says Polyzalos fled to Acragas after turning away travel. Timaeus says Simonides negotiated a peace agreement to stop the war, Theron marched on Syracuse, and Polyzalos left Acragas after allegedly planning a revolt. Theron anchored himself in the west, while Hieron focused on Italy. He forbade Anaxilas of Rhegium from attacking Locri. Presumably following Syracuse's colony on Pithecusae in response to Cumae's request for aid against the Etruscans, who could have been Carthaginian allies when Anaxilas fortified the straits against Etruscan pirates, Hieron, son of Denomides, was conferred bronze helmets at Olympia. Hieron, son of Denomides. Hieron's population moves in Sicily led people from Naxos and Catana to Leontini. Son of Hieron, Denomides rebuilt and expanded Catana as the kingdom of Aetna in 476. Initially in charge was Chromium, Gelon's brother-in-law. At Diogenes' coronation in 470, Aeschylus penned Women of Aetna, while Pindar penned Pythian I. The legendary Theron sank in Acragas some 472 years ago. Thrasydæus arrived at Acragas to become unpopular since he was hated in Himera. Diodorus claimed that Hieron attacked and took Acragas before Dioxenius invaded Syracuse. After Thrasydæus was killed at Megara, Greece, Himera, or Acragas most likely set up a constitutional government and conferred upon Hieron. Rhegium's Italian colonist Mycethus oversaw Anaxilus's sons until he died in the mid-475. Hieron finally gave his sons authority. Herodotus says Misithus was banished, but Diodorus says he led a distinguished life at Tegea, Greece. After Hieron died in 467 following a protracted illness, Aetna named him their founding hero. Our references now refer to Polyzalos nowhere. The entire city turned against him, leading to a civil war in which he employed Aetna and his mercenaries, while some towns, especially Sicily and Greece, helped the Syracusans. Regarding despotism, Thrasybulus was far worse than Hieron. After suffering losses on land and at sea, Thrasybulus quit the dictatorship a year after his victory. Rhegium and Messene drove Anaxila's sons away. After Thrasybulus left, Syracuse's people started democracy, honoring Zeus Eleutherios and freeing surrounding towns. Diodorus claims this was a calm and rich period. Regarding democracy, Syracuse was most definitely democratic in 415. The temples at Himera, Syracuse, and Gela were certainly built before the Dinomenid period's end. Before other, less ambitious temples such as Hera Lacinia were built in the 400s and 50s. Olympian Zeus, the most famous temple in Sicily, which dates back to 500, might have been put on wait. Throughout the dictator's rule, the major cities saw no variation in the forms of money used. The conviction that the kings were summoned after Demeter instead of Demerete might have persisted long after they were overthrown. Several smaller towns adopted different forms once their senior populations returned. After a period of darkness in which gold coins, some known as zankel, were produced, Rhegium embraced Anaxilus's later designs and dubbed them Doric messages. After Gelon's devastation, Gela rebuilt Camarina. Catana focused on keeping her present population, and Aetna moved to the inner Sicel hamlet Inessa. Still, There was a lot of unrest as people moved under the despot's orders and tried to get back home and gather their possessions. In Messana, meanwhile, despondent mercenaries were first unwelcome but finally welcomed. Diodorus then describes the disturbance and indignation brought about by Syracuse's citizens' enrollment and distribution. Tyndaredes and his supporters were put to death trying to project a dictatorship. The Syracusans responded by developing petalism, eradicating dangerous people like the Athenians' ostracism. Potanium was forbidden. Following several explosive outbursts, the powerful people concluded that avoiding politics was safer. As such, a populist revolution was conceivable. The eminent leaders of this age might have acquired a sophisticated rhetorical approach. Inspired by the philosopher Empedocles, Acragas reportedly changed the Council of 1000 to make it more democratic, turned down an offer of kingship, and fled to the Peloponnese upon city exile. The upheavals made Docu-Series, the sole Sicel chieftain confirmed by Greek sources, well known. He debuted once he signed on the team. Under his authority, he assaulted Aetna Catana, built Menaenum west of Leontini, advanced Morgantina deeper into the interior, united all Sicel towns save Hybla in the south and called Menae Palace. This was done to enable Syracuse's ancient residents to return. He might have killed Dinomenes, king of Aetna Inessa's son, from Hieron. Having defeated Motium and banished the Syracusan army dispatched to fight Alexander, he invaded Acragas territory. Following the winter's denunciation of their leader, the Syracusans sent a second expedition. Acragas took Motium. Ducetius was beaten in a decisive battle, and his army left him behind. Respecting the rights of suppliants, Ducetius left for Syracuse as a beggar. The assembly sent him to Corinth, Greece, with a maintenance allowance. Declared war on Syracuse, Acragas unintentionally founded a colony on the northern coast of Sicily at Cale Acte. After Syracuse defeated Acragas, Ducetius might have used Cale Acte as a stage for future growth, but he passed away before he could. Syracuse, Sicily's most important Greek city, lost a rival when Acragas fell. Palace may have been taken and destroyed during the inner Sicel city conquest. Although Athens's participation in the Corinth-Corcyra conflict was recorded a few years too early, this large fleet was absent when Athens set out for an expedition to Sicily in 427. Diodorus claims Syracuse had built 100 triremes, modernized its other troops, and increased its payback to the Sicels before the Peloponnesian War. Diodorus said it ruled over every Sicel town. Thucydides claims that other towns either defected or were never taken under control. Western cities grew separately, and Athens impacted the temple architecture more than any other Siciliot city. From the middle of the 6th century until the middle of the 5th century, Silenus was active in temple building. Hera's temple and G date to the early 5th century, while temples A and O date to the middle of the 5th century. Built in the 450s and finished towards the north at the end of the century, the Elemen Temple Egesta. Although Lilybaeum and Halysii did not yet exist, Diodorus notes a conflict between Egesta and Lilybaeum in 454. 3. Athens formed an alliance with Halysii in the late 430s. Poseidonia, a rich city south of Naples in the Italian Republic, built several temples between the 6th and the 5th centuries. Built after 474, the temple of Poseidon, probably Zeus, resembled those of Himera and Syracuse, two events most connected with the presence of Greece in Italy, Anaxilas's rule in Rhegium, and Hieron's victory against the Etruscans in 474. As a Croton dependent under Croton's rule, Italy destroyed Sybaris. Other attempts were made to build a fresh Sybaris, one in the 400s and 70s, when Hieron may have sent Polyzelos to assist the Sybaris, and another in 453/2. when a man called Thessalus produced coins influenced by the colonies Laos and Posidonia. Reacting to a call for aid, Sparta and Athens designated the city Sybaris in 446/5. A handful of the original Sybarites moved to Sybaris on the Trays, southeast of Sybaris, and struck coins bearing Posidonia's name. The Brutii, who lived nearby, overcame them finally. People from Athens and others arrived. Thus Thurii was renamed and rebuilt in 444/3. It resolved the conflict between the immigrants and the ancient Sybarites for administrative posts and the best land. Athens developed a great fascination with the West in the middle of the 5th century. It persisted throughout Sybaris's ultimate founding and Neapolis's construction. The inscription proves an alliance between Athens and Rhegium in the middle of the 440s, an earlier alliance with Leontini, and perhaps Haliceae, close to Egesta in the late 430s. Diodorus relates a conflict among the immigrants about who founded Thurii. Delphi was consulted, and Apollo was credited with the founding, favoring the anti-Athenian side. Inspired by Zeus Homarios's Achaean League, which sought the Achaeans as mediators, Croton, Sybaris, and Colonia banded together before 417. Tradition holds that Croton was the most strong city among the Italiots. Nevertheless, the Pythagorean conference rooms were destroyed during the upheaval. Thurii belongs in the Croton League more than any other Sybarite town. Sadly, Thurii's entry into the Italian ecology is yet unknown. When the Sabellian tribes emerged from southern Italy and pressured the Greeks, Thurii fought under exiled Spartan general Cleandridas against the Lucanians. The new Thurii was welcomed to offset this pressure. Thurii's claim to Cyrus's colony on Taras set off the strife. Once more, Cleandridas took command of Thurii's army. Following his victory at Olympia, Taras moved the colony to Heraclea and built spear butts to mark their triumph. From 431 to 404 BC, Sparta and Athens engaged in the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides noted in his book was the most important conflict ever waged. Following their Euboea, the Peloponnesians and Athenians broke the 30 Years' Treaty. I started by outlining the grievances and arguments over why the Greeks broke the contract, so I avoided answering questions about how such a major conflict developed between them. This was the strongest case, even if the language was vague. The Athenians grew more muscular, which made the Spartans fight from fear. Both sides made public the following issues, which motivated them to violate the agreement and start a war. Notwithstanding other reservations about Aegina and Megara and an Athenian warning that Sparta should not rush into war, the Spartans decided that Athens was mistaken and that they should go to fight. This paragraph marks Thucydides' conclusion. Sparta worried more about Athens' growing might than about her allies. He uses the development of Athens during the Pentacontaitia, the 50 years following the Persian Wars, to bolster his assertion. He then relates two grievances, Corcyra and Potidaea, and a Spartan conference in which Corinth and others pushed Sparta to act. After that, the Peloponnesian League gathers under Sparta's war declaration. Then Sparta expressed her concerns and asked Athens to give the Greeks their freedom in a propaganda dialogue. Pericles in Athens said Athens was ready, and Sparta would file much more grievances should Athens back off. Later generations wondered why Thucydides offered two separate readings for his narrative. Should we follow him in believing that Athens, Sparta, and Corinth started the war? He neglected the other two, yet why did he spend so much time on two? We must review his report closely to handle the broader issues. To the north of Corcyra, Epidamnus was a Corinthian colony. After failing to create emotional and long-lasting ties with its colonies, Corinth welcomed Corcyra with wide arms in the 5th century. After overthrowing the oligarchs, they went to Corinth and teamed with the native Taulantians to attack Epidamnus. Epidamnus granted Corcyra's requests. Fresh immigrants brought by the Corinthians arrived at Epidamnus during the Corcyraean invasion. Corcyra besieged the city and finally took it. According to Thucydides, Epidamnus surrendered in 433, while the Peloponnesian War started in 435. Thucydides debated in Athens in the spring of 433 BCE. 434 was spent preparing for the debate. Athens would gain by absorbing Corcyra's fleet, since Athens, Corinth, and Corcyra had three of the strongest naval forces in Greece, and a conflict between Athens and the Peloponnesians was about to develop. The Corinthians reply that Corcyra's past neutrality proved more evidence of vice than virtue. The war is still raging. Thus, Athens should treat Corcyra like Samos. The Athenians listened to the debates on the first day and agreed with Corinth, but on the second day, they sided with Corcyra. Since the Athenians had formed a defensive alliance to evade war with Corinth, their involvement in the conflict did not violate the 30 Years' peace. Plutarch claimed that Pericles' choice of Lacedaemonius, Cimon's son, was an attempt to humiliate him. Among the 10 Athens ships were a commander from Lacedaemon and a son of Cimon. Pericles' chances of being elected dropped if he carried on his father's opposition to Pericles, given the strength of his rival in the assembly. The Athenians intervened at Sybota, Corcyra's southernmost point and the mainland, to stop the Corinthian invasion. Athens had dispatched 20 additional ships, and when they arrived, the Corinthians withdrew. The Athenians foresaw a disastrous war in the west as early as 433 BC. Thucydides claimed that Athenians were driven to defend Corcyra by the possibility of a conflict with the Peloponnesians. Just before or during the alliance with Corcyra, the Athenians reorganized their finances in 434/3 by paying off outstanding debts to the sacred treasuries, aggregating several small treasuries into a treasury of the other gods, finishing the Acropolis building program, and choosing to spend extra surpluses on dockyards and walls, thanks to Callia's decrees. Thucydides records a grievance directed against Potidaea, the Delian League Corinthian colony. Because of their ties to Corinth, the Athenians put pressure on Potidaea, but he also says they were worried about King Perdiccas of Macedon's might, and Potidaea's tribute record points to pressure already starting to show. From Athens until Corinth destroyed some of its city walls and sent hostages, Potidaea received magistrates yearly. The magistrates stopped visiting. Potidaea objected ineffectually when Sparta threatened to invade Attica should Athens attack Potidaea. After paying tribute in the spring, Potidaea and her allies rebelled. Athens dispatched 2 expeditionary armies to Potidaea and Macedonia. Corinth employed mercenaries and volunteers instead of a formal army to keep its hands clean. After a long siege, the Athenians took Potidaea in 430-29. Another grievance also surfaced in this regard. Thucydides claims that Corinth and the Peloponnesian League pushed Sparta to behave in line with the Spartan assembly. Athens objected to the agreement's autonomy clause in the Saronic Gulf. The pact does not reference Athens or Aegina. A conflict over the holy ground at Eleusis led Megarians on the Corinthian isthmus to be denied access to the Athenian Empire and Attic Agoras. Though this was a common Spartan criticism, Thucydides does not address it. Following the murder of Anthimocritus by the Megarians, Carinus claimed Athens would fight the Megarids twice a year and fiercely oppose them. After the proclamation of exclusion, the herald gave a thorough justification of Athens's aim. Later, when Aristophanes sought the causes of the conflict, the authors claimed, for unknown motives, that Pericles took part in the pivotal battle. People's opinions, or lack thereof, violated treaties in the late 5th century. International lawyers and standing organizations sought assistance in trying circumstances. Megara belonged to the Peloponnesian League from the end of the 30 Years' War. Had Athens gone against the terms of the agreement? Economic sanctions were not expected at the time of the peace deal and were not specifically forbidden. Hence, Athens was not violating the terms of the agreement, but Athens might have overreacted, notwithstanding D'Estee's inventiveness. Qua claims that the edict prohibiting Megara from trade with Athens and the empire excluded her from all around. The Megarians are shown by Aristophanes as voracious, since the Athenians understood that their control of the sea could be exploited for their own benefit and for the advantage of their allies and the disadvantage of their adversary. From the vantage point of the Corinthian people, Thucydides shows Sparta's sloppiness contrasted with Athens's ambition. Rising, the Athenian delegation declined to respond to Sparta's charges and asked Sparta not to start a war. The Spartan king Archidamus advises caution, but the Ephor Sthenelaitis contends Athens has been misled and war is unavoidable. Rather than merely screaming, he urged Spartans to express themselves using different body poses. War is allegedly a rational expansion of power. For Sparta, the Delphic oracle helped. Although Athenians were allowed to visit Delphi all during the war, the first problems brought up during the ceasefires of 423 and 421 were Delphi's accessibility and location. Sparta asked the League for a majority vote before arming the Peloponnesian League for war. During the assembly, Thucydides delivered his second Corinthian speech. Voting on war took place. Thucydides notes in the winter of 432/1, a propaganda exchange quickly reached its climax. Athens cursed Pericles' Xenos Archidamus with Spartan curses in the 460s in payback for Pausanias' murder. When he aimed to become a dictator and challenge Pericles' rule, whose mother is an Alcmaeonid, people were cursed in the 7th century for killing Cylon's adherents. Sparta advised Athens about migration. Sparta stopped the continuous grievances over the siege of Potidaea, the state of Aegina, and Megara's sentence. Apart from that, Sparta would send more allies should Athens fall. The objections were only pretexts. Athens should not lose this advantage by fighting in Attica or extending its kingdom, even if its armed capability was superior to that of the Peloponnesians. Rather, it should target Sparta severely. The Athenians reacted with wrath. Jingo is the issue, not fighting. If we so want, we have men, ships, and tools. The Plataeans most certainly broke an agreement by killing their hostages when the Thebans attacked Plataea in 431. Attaching them, the Athenians think the Peloponnesians might have broken the peace. Fighting then started to erupt, though Thucydides' references to each side's charges against the other suggest otherwise. The Spartans were the first to believe Athens had broken the truce and started hostilities. A few studies claim that he first paid more attention to the objections and only later realized the significance of his strongest case. Given this, the book I am publishing has been changed. Nevertheless, the organization is still logical, and it is easy to envision an earlier edition with the strongest case. Thucydides' response was always two-tiered. His great performance made him a proud historian. Though both statements are valid regarding causes, he prefers grievances and disputes over reason. Though the exact response was made public, the reason behind unknown. Thucydides notes Athens' alliance with Corcyra limits its support and drives Potidaea into joining the Delian League, so avoiding a confrontation with Corinth. Anticipating strife, Athens agreed to back Corcyra's last demands against Sparta. When Thucydides charges the Corinthians with attributing the volunteers who fought for Potidaea blame, he exhibits his political intelligence. While the war started, other people might have concentrated on one or more problems. Aristophanes would have reflected the typical attitude of Athens when he attacked the stubbornness of Megara and Pericles. He included the other two for different uses while presenting exhaustive studies of two issues excluding the others. Thucydides could be criticizing the Athenian treatment of Aristophanes. Admirer of Pericles, Thucydides objected to the idea that he lacked appropriate personal motivations for denying Megara her sovereignty. The way Athens treats Aegina and Megara would offend a skeptic. While Athens is legally entitled to and ready to use arbitration, Corinth orders Sparta to go to war. Sparta is not, though suggesting arbitration when a suitable arbiter cannot be found is an easy way to earn points. The Delian League, with good intentions but welcomed by Sparta, set Athens's path to ascend to power. He might have, nevertheless, gone into more detail on the reasons the treaty failed to preserve a sustainable equilibrium between Athens and Sparta. Emphasizing Athens's conflict with Samos as the most crucial example, he highlights its increasing power. Though he has presented the most convincing evidence for Sparta's participation in the Athens War out of concern for Athenian hegemony, most contemporary readers agree the Peloponnesians started the war. Thucydides set Sparta's slowness against Athens's vitality. Driven by the state's quest of Western trade, Athens and Corinth battled for economic dominance in the 20th century. Given Sparta's readiness to defend Samos in 440, and Sthenelus' attitude in 432, at least individual Spartans should behave appropriately. Almost everyone who starts a conflict wants to convince others of their rightness, as Sparta did by means of complaints. With regard to Athens, the residents made hardly any attempt to prevent conflict. They banded together to challenge the Corinthians and began preparing for a major confrontation instead of staying objective and allowing Corinth and Corcyra undercut each other. Potidaea was under pressure even without Corinthian involvement in 432. We have to determine how far back Aegina and Megara's concerns span. Corinth would surely become agitated by Athens's actions. The Athenians' response did not satisfy the Spartans. The arbitration offer Athens made suggested it would not be accepted, and Pericles' speech underlined that appeasement would not work. Athens was more militaristically ready than the Peloponnesians were. The ambition of Athens to go to war has to be evaluated against whatever Thucydides believes to be the best excuse. Athenians fought to protect their ever-growing hegemony under Pericles, since they observed Sparta's incapacity to challenge it. Although they were eager to seize opportunities, they were more suited than their rivals when the inevitable war arrived, so enabling them to assert triumph, even though they were reluctant to give up their hopes, to prevent the war. The argument would revolve on Athene's authority. Sparta and her allies engaged Athens in a battle fit a land power against a maritime power, in a conflict involving nations with less and less access to cheap money. Sparta had to prevail to question Athens' hegemony since the war was fought for it. Archidamus cautioned the Spartans against charging into war with their inadequate ships and money, which they did not freely or openly offer. More money will be needed. Pericles says in his introduction to Thucydides, "The Peloponnesians cultivate their own land and have little money, either individually or collectively. In addition, they lack expertise in long-distance fighting elsewhere." Success is the avoidance of inadequacy. Though in his first few chapters Thucydides displays his financial sense, he should dig furthermore. Compiling Pericles' speech at the beginning of the war, he observed that most wins were won via good judgment and an abundance of money, and that their power lay in acquiring money from the allies. The tribute lists show that the Athenians got around 400 talents yearly. Thus, when Thucydides stated that the League's original membership comprised 460 talents, he might have overdone. The Acropolis coin indicates that there are currently 5,700 talents. Based on the manuscript language, there were once 9,700 talents. Another version claims that there were 6,000 talents. The Holy Treasury should contain minimum 500 uncoined gold and silver talents. Except for a campaign in Sicily, sponsored all year and reinforced in 425, extensive and costly naval operations were conducted only during the first 2 years of World War II. The Delian League made more general contributions. Thucydides notes fundraising ships, perhaps special levies or pressure on nominal members in 430/29, 448/4. The Great Panathenaea included custom of paying tribute every 4 years. Although the initial wartime estimate for 430 did not change much, a second estimate of 424 based on standardized incomplete tribute lists showed notable rise. 525 apps thus went unevaluated. In 425, Theotipas issued an edict mandating all allies to act as eulogies or collectors for their state's honor. According to a list of tests connected with the choice, over 1,460 skills will be restored. It claims that no state's assessment could be lowered without proving financial difficulty, and that the tribute has dropped to an unacceptable level. Even if the list included unpaid professions, the Athenians would have gained 3 times as much knowledge should they have gathered 1,200 talents. Evaluations were needed all during the Panathenaic era. Still, there's not likely much change in 422's score. Cleinias's order on tribute collecting would follow the 425 assessment sequence. Moreover, Athenians expected of them additional war donations, thuk. 2019 stands for, although Isphora had been used in 434/3, it is uncertain whether it was used for the first time here. A 200-talented Isphora was paid for the first time here. The capital and due for summer of 422 came to be about 7,024 talents. Considered a loan, money taken from the Holy Treasury had interest computed at roughly 6% annually until 424, then at a rate of 1.2% a year thereafter. Andocides notes the Athenians gathered 1,200 yearly and placed 7,000 talents on the Acropolis following the Peace of Nicias in 421 BC. Indeed, given the declining activity following the summer of 422, there would have been a clear recovery. Still, we have records of minor loans between 418 and 7. Used in 296/5, Phidias's gold and ivory Athena monument caused a major financial loss to the other temples. Though Athens never experienced an excess in its public treasury, more money was needed to pay for war expenses. Callias first issued a financial decree demanding payback for the other gods, and detailing the 3,000 talent transfer to Athena's treasury, perhaps in 434 BCE. According to one view, the debts might have been accrued during Samoa's war in 440 to 439 and paid off upon Samoa's reparations. With summaries for 433/2 and 427/6, a computation of the interest due, and a total due in summer 422, approximately 5,600 talents in capital, and 1,424 talents in interest, for Nara. 134 is a table of annual totals including information on loans collected from holy treasuries between 426/5 and 423/2. We have to cut 5,600 from 6,000 to project Athens's just 400 talents left. Before Pericles' speech, some of the money had already been taken. His estimate of 6,000 talents most certainly relates to the Athena treasury. Over several years, the treasuries may have brought income over their expenditure. Unused until 412 was a 1,000 talent pool. Reasonable evidence points to major loans made at the start of the war. 1,145 talents in 432 BCE, 1,370 talents in 431 BCE, and 1,300 talents in 380 BCE, 430/29, only 600 talents in 429/8, and no more than 262 talents afterward. Though not in 421, 424 Athens had considerably less than in 431. While Thucydides trusted Pericles' words, the Athenians spent their money early in the war. Still, after 429/8, a policy change was carried out. The ambitious Sicilian expedition of 415 was started under the mistaken belief that Egesta would cover all expenses. In fact, only 60 talents were supplied up front, and 30 when the Athenians arrived. Nevertheless, the Athenians carried on the campaign and sent notable reinforcements later, according to a fragmentary inscription. Hence, the sale of property confiscated during the 415 religious scandals may have considerably improved Athens's finances. When the Spartans sent troops to Sicily in 413, they built a fort at Deceleia to prevent the Athenians from gaining access to their territory and silver mines. They hoped the tribute paid by the Delian League would be replaced by a 5% port tax, so increasing the income. Lack of ships, capable fighters, and money costs the Athenians their war in 413. Expecting Sparta's Persian support to be passed on to them, the Athenians formed an oligarchy in 411. An oligarchy would not have to pay subsidies to the people. Though they lost Sicily, in 412 the Athenians had to make use of the 1,000 talents they had set aside at the beginning of the war. Note a fundraising trip at 411. The war ran through 405 AD when Athens ran out of money to construct replacement ships for those destroyed at Aegospotami. 10% levy replaced the port tax at the Bosporus 410. Later inscriptions reveal that the Holy Treasury paid off debt using the profits when running out of money in 410 and unable to make payments. Whereas the Delian League and the Athenian state treasury came together before 411, Athena and the other gods joined before 406. Phidias replaced his Athena monument with silver-plated bronze token coins after profit sales of many gold statuettes. Athens was among the most successful Greek city and among the richest in the world in the 5th century. The Corinthians advised taking loans from these sources. Still, more evidence is required to show many people followed this advice. Though only marginally, Corinth, a state of the Peloponnese, claimed it was ready and willing to assist and might have had the most significant financial resources. Delphi backed the Peloponnesian cause while League member Elis watched Olympia and Delphi. Conversely, most of Sparta's allies lived off the ground their helots produced for the messes they ate from and came from agricultural backgrounds. Sparta expected Western Greek assistance, but after 412 she needed more. Part of an inscription, SEG 29-370, describes the little presents Spartans received during the war. Others track the contributions in 411. Persia gave Sparta aid in 412, but Athens lost its economic advantage in Sicily. Athens asked Persia for assistance. Its riches, by Greek standards, was unlimited. It did not need Persian money but wanted Sparta to prevent acquiring it. At last, Sparta could attack Athens successfully at sea and continue until Athens might wane. Each side had allies at the start of the war. Sparta dominated the Peloponnesian League and most of central Greece, while Athens kept the Delian League, Corcyra, and other northwest Greek allies. Not Peloponnesians, people from the Athenian side know their financial situation. Among Greek hoplites in the 5th century BC, Sparta stands for the strongest. Still, the Athenians outnumbered the Spartans 3-1 and were more suited with ships. Per Thucydides notes in his 431 speech, Sparta with the best hoplites, some of which were from 5th century Greece, having 13,000 in the field army, 16,000 reserves, 1,000 cavalries, 200 mounted archers, 1,600 archers, and 300 seaworthy triremes needing 60,000 crew members. Corcyra constructed 50 ships in 430. ships still owned by Chios and Lesbos in 431. Though only sporadically, allies were occasionally used. Sparta turned out the most competent hoplites. Unlike Sparta, most hoplites were farmers who would not fight when their crops required care. The rich participated in hoplite combat since they possessed easy access to weapons. Apart from the hoplites, troops were not given much attention at the beginning of the war, but combat on challenging terrain proved the advantages of light infantry. Two major hoplite battles lost by Athens in Greece during the war were Mantinea in 418 and Delium in 424/3. Plataea's attackers and defenders used heavy machinery at the beginning of the technological era, even though siege warfare was still in its early years. Yet, the city finally yielded to the blockade. Common springtime Spartan invasions of Attica destroyed the crops and made the Athenians fight and lose to drive out from the city. He responded not with a fighting attitude of a hoplites. Pericles said the Athenians should flee their country and follow the city walls, carrying all their needs from the sea. Designed between 450 and 440 BCE, the broad walls connected Piraeus and Athens into one safe area. The empire should be defended, but neither should it be under unnecessary risk. The city developed depending on its fleet to maintain its authority. Animal boarding was rather common in Euboea and the surrounding islands. Thucydides praised the strategy since it was meant to stop defeat rather than triumph. The costs Athens paid during the war were unsustainable. Thus, several points of view have been proposed, and Thucydides' narrative and naval strategy has to be corrected. The assertion of crowded Athens made by Plutarch could have some truth. Thucydides claims that Pericles' public announcements on avoiding loss and a protracted conflict complement his concentration on attaining this aim. On the other hand, Pericles secretly hoped that by proving to the Peloponnesians Athens was immune to their attacks and able to defend itself, the Peloponnesians would realize they had undertaken an impossible task by challenging Athens' power and conceding. Defeat, so proving Pericles wrong. Since the fall of 431, Megara has witnessed biennial invasions leading in bloodshed. Though Thucydides does not state it, the naval war of 430 might have led Argos to renounce its neutrality. Taken in 430 but not kept, Prasiae in the Peloponnese remained unbiased until 420. Should the Athenians have taken Megarid, their hoplites could have fought a single city and gained a notable tactical advantage instead of the combined Peloponnesian army. Plutarch says Cleon was among those who disagreed with Pericles' 431 defense strategy. Thucydides notes in 431 of Pericles' defensive approach some shortcomings. After Pericles died, a riskier strategy was under discussion. At the start of the war, Athens regarded northwest Greece as an outpost of Peloponnesian strength with their sea access and several Corinthian colonies. Demosthenes came short on his candidature for Aetolia in 424. Thanks to Cleon's assistance, Athens acquired a foothold in Sparta's territory, was rich in Pylos in 425, and Spartan hostages to stop the next attacks on Attica. If not from the beginning, ambitious expectations were finally set in a 427 Sicilian invasion abandoned in 424 when the Sicilian Greeks negotiated a settlement. Nicola took Cythera in 424, and Demosthenes made a failing attempt on Boeotia in 423 to 424. Sparta's most notable flaws were its helots and perioikoi, whose allegiance was questionable. Though this did not happen particularly, Sparta worried Athens would use Pylos and Cythera to cause disturbance over Laconia's whole domain. Thucydides omits to mention whether this resulted from the Athenians' incapacity to grab their advantage or failed attempts. Pericles was right to caution against accepting more risks. Although Athens' dreams for triumph in Sicily were unreal, the Peace of Nicias in 421 revealed that a protracted struggle in which Sparta failed to destroy Athens would not be sufficient. Though Thucydides showed little pity for Athens, he felt it was essential to look for opportunities for success while lowering unneeded risk. While most academics think the count was more like 30,000, Plutarch notes that 60,000 army men attacked Attica in 431 BC. Originally from allies north of the Isthmus, all of the cavaliers Sparta hired in 424 came from between 431 and 412-412. Just 100 ships made up the largest Peloponnesian fleet. Corinth and her allies had 150 ships. The Peloponnesians have to clearly win if Athens' hold over them is to be undermined. They barely had any chance of defeating the Athenians at sea, and far less of storming Piraeus or Athens. Most Greeks tried to negotiate with the Athenians, since most of them believed they would not hold out for very long in 430. Starting the war, they invaded Attica in order to destroy the crops and motivate the Athenians to fight. When Athens threatened to kill the Pylos hostages, the Spartans halted their campaigns on Attica and came to peace with the Greeks in 425. The campaign on Piraeus was shelved for the next winter, after the demoralizing end of the naval battles in 429. In 432, the Corinthians advised Thucydides several tactics, including severing ties with Athens' allies, reducing its wealth, and building a fort from which Attica could be regularly attacked. Epistekismos demands a situation whereby a small army can maintain a strong posture after the formation of a more major force. When the Peloponnesians took Deceleia in 413, Athens relocated many of its residents to Sicily. Some Peloponnesians wanted to live apart from Athens. When Peloponnese disobeyed Athens in 424, Mytilene asked for her help. Sparta's approach for the second invasion of Attica hindered the allies, and the army sent that which would have been more effective. After Corinth released upper-class hostages taken in 433 to start an anti-Athenian revolt, a worn-out Corcyra saw the triumph of the democratic movement backed by Athens. While Demosthenes was the most audacious Athenian about strategies, Brasidas was the most bold Spartan. Known for storming Piraeus and criticizing the Peloponnesian navy in early years of the war, he suffered the first loss of the navy in the Corinthian Gulf. After not helping Mytilene in the west, Alcidas became his advisor. Before the war, the Arcadians were engulfed in internal conflict. Sparta did not rule the Peloponnese as Athens supervised the Delian League. Elis had promised Zeus 1 talent yearly, but by 421 he had given up and turned to Sparta. Sparta most likely believed Argos would only honor the 30-year peace agreement reached in 421. Argos had never been friends with Sparta. On the contrary, few of Sparta's friends could be convinced to accept Nicias' peace. The Spartans might have fought and defeated the Athenians at sea in 412 until the Athenians were expended with Persian support. To get their temporary support, Sparta promised to pay Persia's taxes and return the mainland territory of the Greek Minorians back to Persia. Early on, Sparta lacked this support since the Athenians were more eager to believe Sparta following their loss in Sicily in 415 to 414. And this presented a challenge for a state asserting to be defending Greek freedom. Beginning in the spring of 431, when Spartan king Archidamus sent a herald there, the Archi-Daemian War was the first phase of his attack of Athens's territory. Tensions between Athens and Corcyra grew as the war between Corinth and Corcyra came to an end, while Athens besieged Potidaea. Most Greeks were convinced by Sparta that it was entitled to free the Greek people and destroy the Athenian Empire. Claims Thucydides' Aegine's people were expelled by Athens, and the relationship between Athens and Megara deteriorated over the first year of the war. Following the early spring Theban attack on Plataea, Athens evacuated all except the fighters, spared them, and supplied a garrison and goods. The Peloponnesians attacked Attica virtually annually, from 429 to 425. In 429, they besieged Plataea. Earthquake set off their flight in 424. 15 days of battle in Pylos drove them from there in 425. Should another invasion take place, the Athenians promised to execute their hostages. The longest invasion, 430, lasted 40 days. Grapevines and olives have great durability. Therefore, it seems unlikely that over time the Peloponnesians would have reduced the agricultural output of Athens. Wanting more than the conventional calendar, he fashioned his own seasonal years out of about 8 summer and 4 winter months. Examining the important Archidamian war events by area would be more logical here than by year. Athens could sail to northwest Greece to reach Peloponnesian supporters. After Acarnania and Cephallenia were captured, they grabbed 2 unclaimed islands, Laconia and Elis. There were 100 Athenian ships and 50 Corcyraean ships among the 431 naval actions. Following winter, a Corinthian expedition helped Astacus' Acarnanian king to recover a banishment. In relation to Athens, a Peloponnesian attack on the island of Zacintha came back short 430. Likewise meaningless was Ambratia's attack on Amphilochian Argos from Barbaria, together with its continental allies. Under Phormio, who had been active in the west earlier, Athens sent 20 ships to assist the Messenians in leaving the Peloponnese in the 450s. Peloponnesians helped Ambracia launch a fierce attack on Acarnania in 429. When the Middle Barbarians startled Spartan Cnemus in the south of Acarnania, he fled to Stratus. Phormio threatened even with more than twice as many Athenians as the Peloponnesian army. To join Cnemus, Corinth and her allies have to cross the Phormio at Naupactus. With their ships turned outward, Athenians passed in a circle around the Peloponnesians. Seeking to learn the better traits of the Athenians, the Spartans left Acarnania and dispatched Nemus, Brasidas, and others as advisors. Phormio was told to march west from Naupactid to the little gulf opening when the Peloponnesians attacked, but the Peloponnesians eventually prevailed. Whereas the Peloponnesians had 77 ships, Athens had only 20. Following 11 escaping Athenian boats toward Naupactus, Phormio turned loss into triumph, believing he had won the war. Although Athens had sent more than 20 boats than before, they needed more time to assist, as they were en route to a battle in Crete. Before returning to Athens, Phormio accompanied the Acarnanians through winter. Nobody had heard from him, thus he most certainly had died. At the Acarnanians' demand, his son Asopius accepted his post at Naupactus. Corinth's repatriation of upper-class captives caught in 433 in 427 questioned her democracy and relationship with Athens. He campaigned unsuccessfully both there and in the pro-Spartan Leucas before his murder. For 7 days, Corcyraean Democrat killed their opponent in Greek towns, while the Athenians listened to Thucydides lament the declining standards between pro-Athenian Democrats and pro-Spartan oligarchs. From Athens, Nicostratus and Alcides respectively helped the Democratic Party and the oligarchy. Alcides left against Brasidas' advice, knowing that 60 more Athens ships were arriving. 2 generals and 20 ships were sent to Syracuse to prevent grain from being transported to the Peloponnese and find out whether they could seize control of Sicily during a war involving Leontini, Syracuse's ally. Leading the delegation was the orator Gorgias. The Athenians most certainly thought about seizing Sicily once the war ended. Leading the Athenian army at Naupact, Demosthenes and Procles first headed toward Leucas, but the Messenians at Naupacca in the northeast pushed them toward Aetolia, 424. The Peloponnesians would have had more time to defend their crops even if they had imported food from Sicily. Knowing of the preparations of the other invaders, Demosthenes wanted to reach Boeotia during the same summer, independent of the conditions. After their victory, the Athenians planned frontal attacks on Boeotia this year, so creating the path for an invasion from the west. Procles was among those killed when the Athenians left Aegytium. Demosthenes tried to withdraw his men to Naupactus. Lightly armed men from the surrounding hills attacked them with missiles. Thucydides claims Demosthenes was banished. The ground was unsuitable for hoplites, thus they asked for help from Aetolians with modest armed capacity. Using Naupactive, the Aetolians drove Eurylochus, the Spartan commander of Heraclea, to send the Acarnanians to support Heraclea. After the Acarnanians asked Demosthenes to lead their army against Eurylochus, Eurylochus traveled with Ambracia to pill Amphilochian Argos over the winter. Following Aegytium, the Peloponnesians ambushed and routed him in the northern city. To tarnish their reputation, he let the Peloponnesians leave, but not the others. Later, he sent an Ambracian army in an early morning battle near Idomene. According to Thucydides, the Athenians would have taken control if the Acarnanians had not bothered about Ambracia. Like his accounts of Athens' naval expeditions in 431 and 430, Thucydides' narrative has to be finished and underwritten. The people also agreed to a 100-year contract. Even if the Athenians won this war, they finally lost. While the Sicilian War raged, the Corcyra oligarchs continued to persecute the Democratic Party. The Western allies convinced Athens to send 40 more ships to Sicily during the winter between 424 and 425. Pythagoras replaced Laches, the only surviving ancient leader from 2 centuries past. In spring, 425-60 Spartan ships backed Corcyra's oligarchs. Demosthenes had been let use the Peloponnese fleet. Athens sent 40 ships to Corcyra under Sophocles and Eurymedon to assist the democratic forces. In the sections that follow, Thucydides stresses chance and cuts preparation. The island of Sphacteria leaves a more obvious gap to the south and a small gap to the north on the west coast of Messenia. Under the northern opening, a storm let the Athenians erect defenses on the mainland. While the Spartans withdrew from Attica, marched to Pylos, and called ships from Corcyra, Demosthenes commanded the return of the Athenian fleet, which had hardly reached Zacintha behind the ships headed north. Cleon broke the agreement during the Athens assembly. The Spartans were captured when Athens attacked their ships, threw some of them on Sphacteria, and invaded the port. Cleon started making fun of Nicias, the commander dispatched to Pylos, and he resolved himself to take his place. Of the 420 men that started, 292, including 120 Spartans, turned themselves in. 20 days guaranteed the Spartans would die there or come back from Sphacteria. 20 days later, Cleon returned to Athens. Sparta was not blessed with harmony. Guarding Pylos were Messenian dialect speakers from Naupactus. Not clear. Though they won, Thucydides hated the Athenians. Sophocles and Eurymedon stayed at Corcyra, where they eventually survived. The Democrats caught were mercilessly killed. Before Corcyra's involvement in 415 to 414 BC, hardly was known about Athens's Sicilian invasion. Following the armistice between Camarina and Gela on the Athenian side, Eurymedon and Sophocles arrived in Sicily in the fall and met in Gela in 424. Telling Hermocrates of Syracuse the Athenians' intentions, Thucydides counsels him to seek peace rather than outside aid. After the agreement of Greece and the Aegean islands, Athens came back as a confident and aspirational city. Eurymedon was fined. The other 2 were banished. They claimed to have paid Eurymedon to retire. Sent with a few ships in 422, Phaeus and the other 2 envoys returned home after a hostile reception. Athens. The Peloponnesians attacked Attica in the spring before 425. Syracuse captured Leontini in 427 with Athens's assistance. Exiled democratic leaders helped them to establish strongholds and gradually regain their independence. Athens began attacking Megara twice a year in autumn. Thus, Charinus's order directing Megara's attacks had to have been issued in the summer of 431. Moreover, despite years of a dangerous maritime conflict, sending massive, expensive forces in 431 has not shown any notable outcomes. About 50 ships from Western allies and hundreds of Athenian ships comprised the great naval expedition, dispatched by the Athenians. Apart from destroying the west coast of the Peloponnese, the invasion went north. Another 30 ships were sent along the Gulf of Euboea, and Aegena's people, many of whom had migrated to Thyrea on the east coast, were expelled. Attached by Megaris, Brasidas of Sparta attacked Piraeus in the winter of 429 to 430. Epidaurus was not taken by the 430 Athenian expedition to the Argolid. Many other sites were devastated. Praesia, south of Thyrea, was seized and plundered but not used as a stronghold. Not guarding Piraeus against a sea attack, an assured Athenian who felt strong at sea neglected. After the Peloponnesian invasion, Athens tightened security, but the Peloponnesians lost their cool and targeted Salamis instead of Piraeus. Lesbos was a mostly self-sufficient city supplying ships in the Delian League. Along with Methymna, Mytilene intended to bring together other towns. Before the war, Sparta opposed Athens's rebellion against it, but Athens swiftly joined the movement upon warnings from rivals. Athens sent 40 ships to answer a call for aid from Peloponnesian officials during the Olympic celebrations. While August had to be occupied with Peloponnesian farmers for the mission to be successful, Sparta wanted to attack Attica to divert the Athenians' attention. Instead, the Athenians invaded the isthmus and besieged Mytilene with more men. The Spartans sent Alcides and Salathus to let the people know help was on its way. Alcides marched cautiously, but instead of gathering allies, he caught and killed his enemies. Salathus died following support of opposition against Mytilene's expected arrival. They thus failed. The great news led a second ship to start right away, sparing all men from certain death. An inscription notes a rest period following the loss of Mytilene's ships, defenses, and mainland possessions, and the change of land ownership to Athens' priests. Alcides ran to Greece while storms pursued her. Pachys found Colophon in Ephesus, taken over by a group supported by Persians. A few Mytilene exiles attacked the adjacent mainland. Possibly in response to pressure from Thebes or the epidemic in Athens, the Peloponnesians besieged Plataea in 429. According to Thucydides, half of the men left Plataea during the winter of 424 to 427, and Athens stopped lending help. A small number of women were enslaved, and following their submission in 427, the men were executed. Nicias led the Athenians to attack Melos, the last island in the Aegean not under Athens's control, in 424, but they were routed. Though near to Athens and regarded as a loyal friend, Thucydides used the story of Plataea to highlight several facets of the war. A Spartan inscription from the 420s to the 410s states Melos made financial contributions to the city prior to her alliance with Sparta. He was among a sizable army headed from Athens to Tanagra in southeast Boeotia near the Gulf of Euboea. Having emerged from the war triumphant, they went back home. This summer, Demosthenes wanted to pass from Boeotia through Aetolia. Still, a concerted effort was challenging since Athens mistreated the great shrines on the Greek mainland, and the Greeks might have felt that the gods were hostile following the epidemic. They purified Delos more completely than Pisistratus had in the 6th century in the winter of 424 to 425 by eliminating the dead, stopping births and deaths, and planning a great festival. Let to go back, they drove the living Delians out in 422. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, the abandoned Apollo temple building was developed. Demosthenes' Athenian fleet reached the Saronic Gulf, 425. Nicias kept a garrison at Methana in Argolid in 425, when Demosthenes brought an Athenian fleet into the Saronic Gulf. Cleon has been sent to Argos. The Athenians will surely team with Haliaeus not too far off. Chios erected a new wall honoring Mytilene in response to Athens' objections during the 425 to 426 winter. The inscription says, "The Chian exiles, Sparta followers." Chios might have promised Athens allegiance at this time. Under Nicias, an Athenian fleet attacked the Aeginetans' village in Laconia, destroying it and bringing the survivors to Athens as hostages in 424. Nicias also takes Cythera captive. They have exiled these individuals. Athens devastated Megara daily. The Athenians could only fulfill what the Spartans hoped, with Pylos and Cythera under their hands. Although Athens wanted them against their own oligarchs, the democratic leaders of Megara agreed to make Athens the capital in the summer of 424 after exiled oligarchs seized Pegae. From the great walls separating Megara from Nicaea, Hippocrates and Demosthenes commanded an Athenian army that seized Nicaea. Athens kept Nicaea even if the Megarians captured and destroyed the great walls of Athens during the winter. While Megara stayed closed, Brasidas terrified the Athenian exiles as he prepared for a northern expedition so they might recover power. A second plot vanished during the 424/5 winter. A group of pro-Athenian Democrats in Boeotia devised a plan whereby Demosthenes would betray Siphae by sailing from Naupactus on the Gulf of Corinth. While a revolt in the northwest would be started, an Athenian army would advance on the Delian Apollo temple in the southeast. The scheme was revealed, and the expected synchronism fell short, allowing the Boeotians to manage all the threats concurrently. Still not known, though, is whether Athens received sufficient assistance from Boeotia to support this initiative. Demosthenes left when he found the Boeotian troops had taken Siphae and Chaeronea en route to Siphae. Leading most of his army toward Athens, Hippocrates strengthened Delium with a sizable tax of citizens and Medic hoplites. Under Pagodas's command, 1,000 cavalries and 7,000 hoplites from Tanagra joined other light-armed fighters under the Boeotians. The right wing of each phalanx was winning the war. The Thebans on the right were especially positioned 25 deep, like hoplite fights. But the Boeotians defeated the Athenian army when Pagondas revealed some secret cavalry. After disputes over its position and the return of the Athenian dead, the Boeotians rebuilt Delium. Disturbance following the fall of Delium could have inspired the Athenians' attack of Euboea. Depending on the lumber availability in Macedon, Perdiccas moved between Athens and the Peloponnesians. In 422, the Boeotians broke Panactum in the highlands between Attica and Boeotia. In 423, the Thebans destroyed the pro-Athenian Thespiae wall west of Thebes. After a protracted and expensive siege, the Athenian colony of Potidaea turned itself in the winter of 430-29 under an agreement with the Thracian king Sitalces. The Chalcidians of Olynthus and their neighbors, the Bottiaeans, rose against Athens at the start of the war. Following a battle among hoplites, the Athenians attacked Spartolus west of Olynkos in 429, but were driven back by the light cavalry and cavalry of their enemy. The Athenians were supposed to assist Sitalces attack Perdiccas and the Chalcidians the following winter, but they failed to show up since they needed more assurance he would act. August saw Sitalces. Having negotiated with Perdiccas, he left after seizing Macedon and the territory leading to Chalcidice. The first evidence of Spartan interest in the north, the Trachinians welcomed the Spartans to Heraclea, close to Thermopylae, in the winter of 425/427. Inscriptions imply that Athens and two Delian League cities, Methone in Macedonia between 430 and 423, and Aphytis on the western prong of Chalcidice about 424 or 427, set aside particular arrangements. The victory of the Athenians at Pylos and Cythera caused the Spartans to lose confidence. Seen getting 1,000 Peloponnesian mercenaries and an army of former slaves ready to seize this part of the Athenian territory is Brasidas. This makes it also logical that the Chalcidians and Brasidas sought assistance at some time. He started his path having assisted the Megara oligarchs. Arriving in Macedon from Heraclea and Thessaly, Perdiccas meant to use him against Arrhabaeus. A confrontation with Brasidas drove Perdiccas to give up helping him. After Acanthus, a split kingdom on Chalcidice's eastern coast, Brasidas' next stop was Athens. Historian Thucydides distinguished himself in the winter of 424 to 423. Delivering a speech exactly like one he has already given, Thucydides states he will wipe their crops should they refuse to cooperate. He does not intend to help one faction against another, or substitute one king for another. After hearing his speech, the Acanthians changed to him personally and became concerned about their unharvested grapes. Thasos' general was thus banished. Cleon most likely issued the order. Brasidas sought Sparta for reinforcements. The Athenians sent garrison troops instead. As more cities left Athens, Brasidas became known. Agreeing to a one-year truce to build a long-term alliance in 423, Sparta and Athens, Cimon visited Brasidas only after learning Mende refused to submit following the ceasefire. Brasidas fought for Perdiccas. Nicias and Nicostratus' Athenian army arrived, retook Mende, and besieged Sione against Cleon's orders to recover Sione. Brasidas attacked Potidea in 422. Sparta had sent reinforcements to Brasidas. Perdiccas, now working with Athens, devised a plan to prevent the main body from crossing Thessaly. It continued till August, the end of the truce. Cleon dispatched a sizable army north immediately after it sank. Arriving at Eion, after conquering the middle prong of Chalcidice, Torone Brasidas mostly lived in Amphipolis. Cleon sent uneasy Athenians on a reconnaissance expedition. After Brasidas' attack, the Athenians withdrew to Cleon, realizing their presence. The Athenians fell into a trap even if Thucydides exaggerated Cleon's timidity and Brasidas' bravery. Once Brasidas' passage was known, the Thessalians prevented the Spartans from deploying troops to the northeast. When Athens successfully quelled the Mytilenean revolt and turned back the invasion, the Peloponnesians realized how far behind they were in maritime strength. Brasidas, the founder of Amphipolis, had not yet visited Athens. Even if the Athenians beat the Peloponnesians, a short fix seemed improbable. When the Athenians started spending money, Thucydides hesitated to admit that Pericles might have been more hopeful than he was. Though the illness is not entirely recorded, Thucydides notes the symptoms and how they affect Athenian morale, as summer 430s congestion in the Athenian walls led to an epidemic lasting until 426/5. Third of the hoplites and cavalry perished. Third of the civilian population perished as well. Following backlash over his defensive approach in 431, 430 Pericles was sacked and punished for bringing Athens into the war. The Athenians then aimed to compromise with Sparta. Usually the case, there was no peace since every state believed it had the upper hand. Pericles was re-elected. The plague subsided as the war progressed. Nicias and Plistoanax, the rulers of Athens and Sparta, were ready to launch the conflict after their deaths. Then the Athenians managed their money and implemented more audacious ideas. By taking Pylos in 425 and Cythera in 424, Athens could force Sparta under pressure. In 425, Sparta made peace gestures. Athens turned down them. A few of these initiatives might have been more sensibly allocated. After its triumphs at Pylos and Cythera, Athens lost at Megara in 424, Boeotia in 424/3, and the northeast between 424 and 422. Beginning at 425, both Spartans and Athenians longed for peace. As a result, the truce since spring 423 was kept until August 422. Both sides realized from the beginning the need of future projects. Iran finds itself in conflict. In 430, Athenians in Thrace misled and killed Peloponnesian envoys to Persia. Aristophanes writes of an Athenian embassy living in luxury without Persian money in his drama Acharnians in Spring 425. Learning of King Artaxerxes' passing, the Athenians sent their envoys back to their nation. Most likely, the Athenians claimed that Spartan envoys should have sent a consistent and unambiguous message, since Persia had sought the return of the Asiatic Greeks, causing great suffering for Sparta. They captured a Persian envoy on way to Sparta in 425 and had his letters translated. Conversely, Andocides cited the Athenian stupidity in alliance with the king through their uncle Epicletus, which they subsequently destroyed to assist the rebel Amorges in 392/1. A plaque also notes that Heraclides of Clazomenae, who later became an Athens citizen, helped the king to come to an agreement. Though Thucydides only remembers the failed expedition rather than the successful one, whereby Darius II defeated his rivals and became king, the Athenians signed a contract with Darius II. Although it would have been more difficult for the Athenians and Darius than the Spartans, a non-aggression agreement might have satisfied them in 423. Sparta and Athens started their peace initiatives in 422/1. Sparta built a hostile fort against Attica following the winter to pressure Athens. 10 years following the beginning of the war, the Peace of Nicias was established. 50 years of exact terms for the return of prisoners taken and conquered during the war were under effect. 6 northeastern towns stayed neutral while paying the same tribute to Athens. The Athenians would treat other towns, such as Scione, based on their preferences. Under the pretext of a voluntary surrender, Thebes was to retain Plataea and Athens Nisaea. Amphipolis was formally returned to Athens. Given Sparta's inability to force Greek freedom and the Athenian Empire's survival of the attack, Pericles and Thucydides ought to have been content with this peace. Still, it must be carried out. The allies of Sparta, Boeotia, Corinth, Megara, and Elis rejected the ceasefire since they did not share Sparta's aim to bring the war to an end. For Athens to release Sphacteria's detainees, Sparta promised a 50-year alliance. Greece's polarization, which had been erratic in the 430s because of broad acceptance and implementation on the Peloponnesian side, was now stable. If Cleon's Athens discusses the epidemic in great detail, Thucydides only skims at Athens' inner issues. While he supports Pericles, he is against his successors. We thus have to investigate material from the late 5th century. 2 of Xenophon's most important writings are the pamphlet The Old Oligarch and the Athenian Constitution. Destroying Athens' democracy would be difficult since it would favor the needs of bad rather than good citizens, and lower social classes ran the navy's ships. Democracy was established by supporting democratic parties in allied countries and moving lawsuits to Athens, preserving that measurement, and enslaved people were no less than citizens. The benefits of Athens as a naval power are questioned and discussed. The connection between democratic ideas and working-class problems is also discussed in the comedy. The conclusion of the pamphlet states that Athens is a rich city, democracy is supported overseas, and there are not enough political exiles to support political attacks in Athens. Where was this essay written? Based on particular ideas in the second part of the 5th century, Thucydides developed a book for rhetorical exercise. Still, there are strong reasons for putting the pamphlet in the early Peloponnesian War. References to Athens's actions while the enemy invaders were now, and the Marines' capacity to attack enemy territory seem logical. These happened during the Archidamus War. Brasidas' trip to the northeast in 424 refutes the presumption that a land army cannot travel far from its base. Headlands or islands between 425 to 424 could have attacked Pylos and Cythera. Thus, our best estimate, if we are looking for a precise date, is 425/4. The book reveals an unthreatened democracy in Athens, unlike 415 when religious scandals were considered anti-democratic machinations, and 411 when democracy was overthrown. Sometimes known as sophists, itinerant speakers questioned conventional wisdom instead of releasing revolutionary manifestos. Given that not all landless people were impoverished, most likely the idea that only the rich suffer from foreign invasions while the poor do not is false, or at least overstated. Sophocles held several official positions, including general in 441/0, member of an emergency committee in 413, and Hellenist representative in 443/2. The third and last catastrophe after Sophocles and Aeschylus was Euripides, but the conflict between state and family, along with divine and human law, captures the intellectual climate of the time. Expressing a more young perspective, he questions the gods' justice in his plays and elevates knowing people above the gods. Euripides lived neither public life nor expressed a more young perspective. He questions the gods' justice and puts knowing people above the gods in his plays. Euripides did not lead public life. One can clearly determine the setting of his plays. Children of Heracles and Suppliant Women and Other Archidamian Wars show Sparta's contempt and awareness of war's challenges. The Boeotian reluctance to return the bodies of Athenian dead at the Battle of Delium in 424/3, when the Thebans refused to return the bodies of Argives slain, most likely inspired the Suppliant Women. Farmers of 425 to 421 parodied Cresphontes of Euripides to ridicule Hermocrates' comments at the Gela conference. In Suppliant Women, Theban Herald's opponent of democracy has Athens ruler Theseus defend it. Especially both tragedies included characters who spoke using the same reasoning as Thucydides, who, together with others whose speeches he related or reorganized, created the intellectual environment of the time. Though in a way that confused historical perspective and produced much scholarly debate, the Athenian Old Comedy had at least some commentary on modern people, political events, literature, and philosophy in the 420s. In his drama, Babylonians, Aristophanes parodied Cleon and political leaders. Cleon attacked him, therefore, and might have pursued criminal charges. Others have survived since then. The Acheronian fight moves forward, while the hero watches. In Knight's Cleon, the even more nasty sausage salesman who releases Demos from Cleon's captivity replaces the nasty leather salesman Cleon. Cleon gave the order to the Demos, who owned two enslaved people named Nicias and Demosthenes. Written during the Peace of Nicias building, Piece 421 shows a hero releasing her long imprisonment. By stressing the worst reason, a better cloud misfits Socrates as an ordinary sophist fascinated by celestial events. Love Lawsuit Wasps centers on Cleon's addiction, which his father, Hate Cleon, seeks to treat. Assuming that Aristophanes was a pacifist opposed to democracy or valued stylish genius is an oversimplification. Furthermore, A.W. Gaume falsely claimed that he wrote plays just for enjoyment, and that a play has no right or wrong side. A famous Aristophanes quotation claims that even comedists, following a conflict, peace is unavoidable. The patriotism of Aristophanes cannot be questioned. He might have had better plans for dodging and resolving the strife. He presents two different theories as to why the violence in Ak happened. The principal, Megara, and Pericles are heroes in 514-38 and Piece 605-18. Though the stories are fictional, the focus on Megara and Pericles could mirror Athenian society. One could consider the sequence of 729-835 against Megara as an economic denigration. The main objections to Aristophanes or that attractive city speakers misled the Athenian demos, and that the money went to rich people like Cleon instead of common people. He welcomed the empire in the same way as every Athens resident. Cleon and Aristophanes were the most famous politicians and comedians of the 1960s. After the Knights, the butcher overcomes this fragility, even if Aristophanes claims he would defend the Athenian people against clever and appealing orators. Cleon would have justified his contempt of Aristophanes if he had accused him of a crime. Like Thucydides, Aristophanes' plays show consistency, suggesting that he hated upper-class leaders and was more sympathetic to demagogues like Cleon. He rendered Thucydides exactly as he had. Many Athenians thus laughed at Love Cleon while still trying to fulfill their obligations. It could be necessary to clarify how one should understand comments on events. Demosthenes believes Cleon stole Pylos' glory, but was this his impression? Do others see things differently? Is the advice of Aristophanes mild or strong? The assembly processes are summarized in chapters 237 to 79 and 1000 to 1234. Clouds allow us to ascertain whether Aristophanes was a real enemy and whether Socrates was that kind of person in the 4th century. They also help us to identify which parts of Euripides' and Aeschylus's plays he parodied in his Frogs. The way Aristophanes writes about the festivities during the festival of Ach fascinates historians. Pericles and the leaders who followed him left the government to answer demands in their haste to succeed. Pericles' reputation, intelligence, and incorruptibility, Thucydides came to find, kept the people away. The first man thus ruled in line with democratic values. Following Thucydides, the son of Milesius and Pericles, Nicias and Cleon were included in the Aristotelian Athenian constitution. After Pericles passed away, the situation worsened. Instead of revered leaders from past times, the people selected a less-known champion from among the better range. His clothes were hooked to enable wild gesticulation. Thus, he was the first to yell, use profanity, and give monologues while everyone else spoke neatly. More than anyone else, his wild emotions pervaded the people. Since neither Pericles nor the Athens political system can exercise total control, Thucydides exaggerates the distance between Pericles' rule and later events. What distinguished the Cleon age? Almost all political leaders following Pericles were not born into aristocratic backgrounds. Late 5th century leather was sold by Aristophanes' Cleon. His father's prosperous tanning business helped him to become well known. Several sales highlight the narrative of Aristophanes. His account claims this to be the most recent seller. Greek historian Pericles might have met him in the 430s when he was born in the 470s. His political perspective ran counter to his background in another sense. Nicias had not held any positions or taken part in liturgies, usually carried out by wealthy men to show their civic spirit and acquire supporters before assuming his generalship in 425. Rather, his success came from convincing arguments in courts and legislative halls. Pericles seems far away, even though his criticism of Nicias and his 20-day commitment to Pylos are shown. Though Thucydides' criticism that leaders after Pericles catered to the needs of the populace, leaders have always required communication. Sophists, who teach dialogue as the key to political success, coincide with the advent of demagogues most likely used to describe him and other people leaders. While Thucydides praises Cleon as the most active and persuasive, Aristophanes shows him as making wild promises and accusations against his opponent. Should he accuse and exile Aristophanes, Thucydides and Aristophanes would hate him. The political leaders were chosen among the Cimon and Pericles generations by Athenians. Although those who spoke and suggested actions fell outside the purview of the assembly once Pericles was removed in 430, politicians in power could be held accountable for their activities. Though some politicians occasionally deal with generals in Athens instead of on the battlefield, there is a divide between them. Cleon helped Demosthenes in Pylos, and maybe more times. Still under debate, though, is his level of political activity. Furthermore, hazy is the difference between political mistakes and criminal activity. As such, there was no such thing as loyalty opposition, and nobody would fool the people unless they were paid off by a foreign enemy. This helps explain why public dishonesty charges usually go along with claims of bribery acceptance. Most likely, the family's riches come from his father, who amassed a fortune from the silver mines. Though he did not truly be an aristocrat, Nicias claimed to be. He was a serious and moral man. He often carried out liturgies. Though he was a good leader, he focused more on avoiding loss than attaining success. From 427 through 413, he was general every year. Although he led brilliantly, he prioritized avoiding failure over achieving success. Of the two, which most looked like Pericles? Pericles blessed Nicias's peace and the Sicilian invasion spanning 421 to 413. Cleon's military readiness was bold. Aristotle and Cleon maintained that Athens's might should be limited. Pericles described Athens's dominance as tyranny and Thucydides. If Pericles had lived longer and sought to run the assembly as he did, he could have meant to kill every citizen in a rebellious city. Nicias had oligarchy-affiliated siblings but never opposed democracy. Nicias's son was a victim of the 30 in 404, yet Xenophon claims Nicus and his son never participated in populist activities. Nicus never opposed democracy, even though his brothers were members of an oligarchy. Aristophanes paints Cleonymus as a glutton and coward who fled after the Battle of Delium in 424/3 to support the second assertion. He gave a directive to boost tribute collecting in 426. Thudippus, who presumably wed Cleon's daughter in 425, demanded a reassessment of the contribution. Thucydides ties Hyperbolic's desire to succeed Cleon after his death, for whatever cause, to his early 424 plan to seize Carthage. Thucydides mentions Alcibiades in Book 5, 43. 2. But we are informed that he cared for Spartan captives from Sphacteria for familial reasons and was humiliated when his Spartan ties were disregarded during peace negotiations. Pericles raised Alcibiades via the Alcmaeonids after Cleinias died in 447/6 at Coronea. As an aristocrat, his family honored Sparta by calling him Alcibiades. In 422/1, he issued an edict that displayed his flamboyance, ambition, and egotism. In the late 5th century, educated individuals sought scientific explanations for visible, natural phenomena. In the early 420s, the epidemic decimated Athenians' morale and increased the number of fatalities. Although some questioned whether the plague offended the gods, Thucydides asserts that Athens was not spared for its dedication. Due to the peace of Nicias, which made Epidaurus accessible, the worship of Asclepius was brought to Athens and preserved in the temple of Heracles Alexikakos, the averter of evil. Delos's purification in winter 426/5 may have been another reaction to the illness. The Acropolis was finished in 434/3, although other buildings in Athens and Attica required more combat engagements. The Athena Nike temple on the Acropolis, which was planned in the 440s, was finished in the 420s, and the statue was consecrated in 425. In the 420s, Hephaestus and a few other tiny sanctuaries were constructed, and the agora has 2 stoas of Zeus Eleutherios from the same period. By 420 BC, a wealthy man named Telemachus had transported the Asclepius cult from Epidaurus to Athens, where he constructed a shrine under the south cliff of the Acropolis, west of the Dionysus-dedicated theatre, and erected a monument in his honor. In the 420s, the Nemesis temple of Rhamnus was constructed alongside other Attic structures. According to reports, the Athena Nike temple adopted the Ionic order for political purposes. Large Doric structures from the year 420 are still visible, and it is known that these titles were used in the 4th century. Since grandiose funerals were not standard in Greece until around 425, Athens did not adhere to a particular style but followed the broader trend. In Athens, there was still a feeling of safety. Despite the war and the epidemic, Athenian democracy was not in jeopardy. Money and labor were available for government projects. Until 424, when commanders like Cleon infused a frantic component that Pericles had not seen, the war had more wins than disasters. In 421, it seemed that the Peloponnesian War was over. The 50-year alliance and peace between Athens and Sparta prevented Sparta from destabilizing the Athenian realm. The victory of Athens over Sparta may have led to a short peace. As we have seen, just a few of the treaty's conditions were completed, and some allied states declined to pledge allegiance to it. Thucydides connects the Archidamian War to the events of his second prologue because he believed peace would last. Later, he understood that it had not, and from 431 to 404, he saw the whole struggle as a single war. Corinth would only return its towns to the north-northwest if Acarnania joined the peace. Corinth joined the Peloponnesian nations in rejecting it. All Thracewood communities rejected the peace, including the Chalcidians, who, according to Olynthes, did not wish to return to being Athens' vassals, and then Elis, who hated Sparta for supporting Lepreum against it, fought a losing battle with Tegea together with Sparta. All Thracewood cities were opposed to the 30-year-old peace between Sparta and Thrace. The one point of agreement among the allies was that they wanted to avoid aiding Sparta. Boeotia and Megara refused to join, reasoning that the Spartan aristocracy would be a friendlier relationship than the democracy of Athens. Due to its democracy, Athens drew Mantinea and Argos. Tegea, Mantinea's rival, was courted but rejected. Like the Boeotians and Athenians, the Chalcidians also observed a 10-day ceasefire that may be interrupted with 10 days' notice. As no agreement was reached at Corinth, the truce remained in force. Athens withdrew the Messenians from Pylos due to Sparta's incapacity to keep peace in the northeast and with its allies. Despite Sparta controlling Pylos and other territories, it was intended to cede. During Sparta's invasion of Arcadia, Mantinea seized and mostly disenfranchised the Athens captives. After Athens conquered Sione and slaughtered all its males, just a handful of women and children should have been left to be sold into slavery. The following winter, despite the presence of an Athenian garrison, Olynthes took control of Mechiberna. Throughout the winter of 421-0, circumstances got more challenging. As the new official year started, Sparta's new ephors, Cleobulus and Xanares, rejected the peace with Athens. After a fruitless summit at Sparta, they offered that Boeotia join the alliance that Corinth and others had formed with Argos and bring that alliance into alignment with Sparta. The Argives wanted Boeotia in the alliance as well, but they wanted a bloc like Sparta's size and might. Megara would be included as well. Concerned about alienating Sparta, the Boeotian councils first denied the Boeotarch's proposal for a defensive alliance with Athens, Corinth, Megara, and other northern towns. The technique failed due to a lack of confidentiality. Conversely, the Boeotarchs may have convinced the councils that joining the Argive alliance was Spartan-friendly. The Spartans sought Panactum to restore Pylos to Athens from the Boeotians due to the Nicias peace. The Spartans sought Panactum's return to Athens to retake Pylos. In return for this transfer, the Boeotians sought an alliance with Sparta, so in 420 they dismantled the fort before turning over the territory to Sparta. The Athenians were angered by the devastation of Panactum and feared isolation if Argos joined Sparta. However, Sparta's union with Boeotia broke their covenant. They believed that Sparta was functioning with Athens' approval when it dealt with Boeotia, which engaged in talks with Sparta and achieved a 50-year peace with restricted access to the contested territory. Agonis dreaded loneliness after receiving no more communication from Boeotia. This presented an opening for Alcibiades and other Peace of Nicias opponents. Sparta sent envoys, including Endius of the household of Alcibiades, to avert a breach. Athens sought envoys from Argos, Elis, and Mantinea. Given how hard it is to accept Thucydides' circumstances, it is impossible to see how his tale might have been misconstrued. In settling disagreements, the Athens Council first became aware of the Spartans' claim to be autocrators. Alcibiades met with them secretly and promised assistance if they would not divulge that they were autocrator to the assembly. When the Spartans denied being autocratores in front of the assembly, Alcibiades called them out. An earthquake necessitated the cancellation of the meeting. Nicias attempted unsuccessfully to reach Sparta after the resumption of the assembly. Athens forged a defensive alliance with Argos, Elis, and Mantinea at Alcibiades' urging. As the relationship between Athens and Sparta deteriorated, Corinth's isolation from Sparta began to wane. Athens was missing since it ultimately refused to join the new coalition. Though Sparta and Athens engaged in a protracted conflict years after the Peace of Nicias, asserting their alliance had ended would be erroneous. Sparta's alliance with Boeotia and Athens' alliance with the Peloponnesians rendered neither Sparta nor Athens capable of challenging Sparta on land as they had during the Archidamian War. In 420, Sparta sent an army to Lepreum to retain their Olympic sponsorship. Fearing Sparta may resort to bloodshed, Elis joined the other alliance members in constructing a fortification. Sparta did not disturb the peace, but the city carried grievances for 20 years. Heraclea, the Spartan colony of Thermopylae, was conquered by the people in the winter of 419, and its ruler was murdered. The Boeotians seized Heraclea in the summer of 419 to prevent the Athenians from acquiring it. Heraclea greeted the Boeotians with open arms, but by 413 BCE, the city had returned to Spartan rule. In 419, the Argive coalition laid siege to Corinth. Alcibiades led an allied army across the Peloponnesus to Patri at first. Alcibiades led an allied force across the Peloponnesus to Patri, and fortifications were constructed in Achaea to the Gulf of Corinth with his help. Corinth and Sicyon isolate Rhium at the entrance to the Gulf. Unfavorable signs stopped a Spartan expedition. 2 Argos expeditions were sent to attack Epidaurus, and an Athens conference failed to take Corinth. Argos contended that the Athenians should have blocked Sparta from deploying an army by sea to Epidaurus, while Athens pointed out that Sparta had violated Nicias' peace by reinstalling the Cephalenian helots in Pylos. After the monarch assumed control, the Spartans exerted great effort. At Phlius, Agis gathered a coalition of Boeotian and Corinthian warriors in preparation for an attack on Argos. Agis divided his troops, utilizing Orne's passage to the Argive plain, the Corinthian route around Nemea, and the Boeotian route. The Argives marched to Nemea on the main road to confront the onslaught. When he arrived on the plain, Agis was between the city of Argos and the Argive army, which had turned back after passing the Corinthian contingent. The army of Argive stood between Agis and the army of Boeotia. The commanders on both sides were in difficulty and had wasted an excellent chance since both forces proceeded quietly. Despite the men's beliefs, the army leaders did not think their side was winning. According to Thucydides, the Spartans were victorious. The Boeotians' distance decided the result. Two senior Argives who supported Sparta negotiated a 4-month ceasefire with Agis. Agis' punishment was postponed, but he was appointed to a board of advisors. The Athenian army subsequently arrived at Argos. Alcibiades was present during the meeting. Men with a lower commitment to the partnership were more powerful. Following the Battle of Mantinea, a more significant number of Athenians would arrive. After seizing possession of Orchomenus, the allies moved on to Tegea rather than Lepreum as their next objective. This prompted the Eleans to return home. The Mantinea Mountains were captured by the Argive coalition. Agis led the Spartans to Tegea in response to an instant plea for assistance from friends. As he marched north, he was captured by an opponent approaching him. Agis may have shouted